The Imperium of Man stands as the largest empire in galactic history, a sprawling dominion of approximately 1 million worlds bound together by necessity, fear, and the fading light of a dying god. At its heart sits Terra, the cradle of humanity, now a planet spanning hive of administrative buildings, Gothic cathedrals, and industrial complexes that have buried the ancient surface under kilometers of construction. The sky above Terra has not seen natural sunlight in millennia, choked instead by the perpetual smog of countless manufactorums and the atmospheric processors that make the air barely breathable for its countless billions of inhabitants. Deep within the Imperial Palace, itself a continent-sized fortress that covers much of the Himalayan mountains, the God-Emperor of mankind sits entombed upon the Golden Throne. Once a being of incalculable power who walked among humanity and shaped the course of the species through his vision and will, he now exists in a state between life and death. The Golden Throne, an arcane device of obscure origin that combines human technology with Xenos engineering, functions as both life support system and psychic amplifier. The Emperor's physical form has deteriorated over the 10,000 years since the Horus heresy, his flesh withered to little more than desiccated skin stretched over ancient bones. Yet his psychic presence burns brighter than ever, a beacon that cuts through the roiling chaos of the warp itself. The Astronomicon, that psychic lighthouse which makes faster-than-light travel possible across the Imperium, draws its power directly from the Emperor's will. Without this beacon, navigator houses could not guide their vessels through the Immaterium, and the Imperium would fragment into a million isolated worlds, easy prey for the horrors that wait in the darkness between the stars. The price for maintaining this beacon is steep and paid in human lives. Every day, approximately 1,000 psychers are brought before the Golden Throne in a solemn procession that has continued without interruption for 100 centuries. These psychers, gathered from across the Imperium through the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, are fed to the Emperor's insatiable hunger. Their souls are consumed to sustain his own, their life force burned away in an instant to keep the Astronomicon lit for another day. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's golden-armored guardians who have stood watch over him since before the Imperium's founding, maintain this grim vigil with absolute dedication. The governance of the Imperium flows from Terra through a labyrinthine bureaucracy known collectively as the Adeptus Terra. At its apex sit the High Lords of Terra, 12 individuals who hold the reins of imperial power in the Emperor's name. The composition of the High Lords shifts according to ancient tradition and political maneuvering, but certain seats remain permanent fixtures. The Master of the Administratum commands the vast bureaucratic apparatus that attempts to track and manage a million worlds. The Fabricator General of Mars speaks for the Adeptus Mechanicus and their monopoly on technology. The Ecclesiarch leads the state church and its billions of faithful. The Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum controls the Imperium's sanctioned killers. The Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum directs humanity's countless armies. Other seats include representatives from the Adeptus Arbites, the Inquisition, the Imperial Navy, and various other organs of imperial power. The Senatorum Imperialis serves as the broader administrative council, a gathering of thousands of functionaries, sector governors, and department heads who manage the day-to-day operations of the Imperium. These individuals rarely see Terra itself, conducting their business through astropathic communication and proxy representatives. The sheer scale of the Imperium makes centralized control impossible in any practical sense. Messages can take years or even decades to travel from one side of the galaxy to another, even with astropathic transmission. By the time Terra receives word of a crisis and dispatches aid, the situation on the ground may have changed completely, or the world in question may have already fallen. This communication delay creates a system where individual sector governors, planetary governors, and military commanders operate with enormous autonomy out of sheer necessity. They interpret the Emperor's will as they see fit, guided by the Lex Imperialis, the vast collection of laws, precedents, and edicts that has accumulated over 10 millennia of imperial rule. The Lex Imperialis itself has become so vast and contradictory that entire organizations exist solely to interpret its meaning, and wars have been fought over differing interpretations of imperial law. The ecclesiarchy, formerly known as the Adeptus Ministorum, maintains the spiritual unity of the Imperium through the imperial creed. This state religion proclaims the emperor as the one true God of humanity, a divine being worthy of worship and absolute obedience. The irony that the emperor himself rejected such notions during the Great Crusade, promoting instead the imperial truth of rationality and science, has been conveniently forgotten or suppressed. The ecclesiarchy's power rivals that of any other imperial institution, with the cardinal worlds serving as centers of faith where billions of pilgrims journey to demonstrate their devotion. Ophelia 7 stands as one such cardinal world, its surface covered entirely in cathedrals, shrines, and monasteries. The Missionarius Galaxia, the missionary arm of the ecclesiarchy, spreads the imperial creed to newly discovered or reconquered worlds. These missionaries often arrive alongside or even before imperial military forces, preaching the emperor's divinity and the necessity of compliance. Their message is simple: accept the emperor as your god, submit to imperial rule, pay your tithes and you will be protected, refuse and you will be destroyed. The Frateris militia and the orders militant of the Adeptus Sororitas, the Battle Sisters, enforce the ecclesiarchy's will with bolter and flamer, burning heretics and purging the unfaithful wherever they are found. The imperial creed itself varies wildly from world to world, adapted to local customs and traditions as long as certain core tenets remain intact. The emperor is divine, humanity must be protected, the alien must be destroyed, the mutant must be purged, and the heretic must be burned. On some worlds, the emperor is venerated as a distant, unknowable deity. On others, he is seen as an active participant in daily life, with local saints and miracles attributed to his intervention. The ecclesiarchy tolerates this variation as long as tithes are paid and loyalty remains absolute. Imperial citizenship carries with it obligations that would be considered unbearable by the standards of earlier ages. The imperial tithe demands regular contributions from every world in the Imperium, calibrated according to each planet's classification and productive capacity. Hive worlds provide manpower, their teeming billions serving as an inexhaustible source of bodies for the Imperial Guard. Forge worlds supply weapons, vehicles, and equipment. Agri-worlds ship vast quantities of food to sustain populations that cannot feed themselves. Mining worlds extract raw materials from their planetary crusts until nothing remains but hollow shells. The Administratum maintains vast records of these tithes, though the sheer scale of the task means errors and omissions are inevitable. Entire worlds have been lost in the bureaucratic machinery, their tithes unpaid for centuries, until a zealous administrator discovers the oversight and dispatches a punitive expedition. The Psyker tithe represents perhaps the most feared obligation. Every imperial world must surrender its Psykers to the black ships when they arrive. These individuals, born with the ability to touch the warp, represent both a resource and a terrible danger. Untrained Psykers can become conduits for demonic possession, gateways through which the horrors of the warp can spill into reality. The black ships take them to Terra, where they are tested and sorted. The strongest and most stable become sanctioned Psykers, serving the Imperium as astropaths, battle Psykers, or members of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The weak or unstable face one of two fates: consumption by the Emperor to fuel the Astronomicon, or processing into other resources the Imperium requires. Families rarely know what becomes of their children once the black ships depart. The Adeptus Arbites enforce imperial law with brutal efficiency. These armored judges serve as the Imperium's police force, though they concern themselves only with crimes against imperial authority rather than local law enforcement. Rebellion, heresy, mutation, and failure to pay tithes fall under their jurisdiction. Their fortress precincts stand as islands of imperial authority on worlds across the galaxy, and their judgments are swift and final. The Arbites maintain order through fear, their shotguns and shock mauls dealing out punishment to anyone who threatens the Imperium's stability. Individual human life holds little value in the calculus of imperial governance. Billions die in industrial accidents, gang violence, and simple starvation every day across the Imperium, and the Administratum barely notices. Entire planetary populations can be sacrificed if strategic necessity demands it. Exterminatus, the complete destruction of a world's biosphere, remains a sanctioned response to threats deemed too dangerous to contain. The Imperium has endured for 10,000 years not through compassion or justice, but through ruthless pragmatism and the willingness to pay any price for survival. Every human life exists to serve the Imperium, and the Imperium exists to serve humanity's continued existence. The individual means nothing, the species means everything. This grim reality permeates every level of imperial society. On hive worlds, workers toil in manufactorums for 12-hour shifts, breathing toxic air and dying young from industrial diseases. On feudal worlds, peasants serve noble houses that have ruled for millennia, their lives governed by traditions that predate the Imperium itself. On shrine worlds, pilgrims crawl on bloodied knees toward holy sites, seeking the Emperor's blessing or simply a reason to believe their suffering has meaning. The Imperium offers no paradise, no golden age of prosperity and peace. It offers only survival, purchased through endless sacrifice and maintained through unrelenting vigilance against the horrors that would see humanity extinct. The hive cities of the Imperium stand as monuments to humanity's capacity for both architectural ambition and systematic degradation of the human condition. These colossal urban structures rise kilometers into polluted atmospheres, their foundations buried deep in the planetary crust, built upon the ruins of earlier settlements that have been compressed into archaeostrata by the sheer weight of construction above. A single hive city can house anywhere from 10 billion to over 100 billion souls, packed into a vertical labyrinth of hab blocks, manufactorums, and industrial sectors that dwarf any construction from humanity's earlier ages. The structure of a hive follows a rigid hierarchy that mirrors imperial society itself. At the apex, literally and figuratively, sit the spires where planetary governors, noble houses, and wealthy merchant dynasties maintain their residences. These uppermost levels breach the toxic cloud layers that choke the lower reaches, allowing the privileged few to glimpse actual sunlight and breathe air that has been filtered and purified to near-Terra standard. The spires feature architecture that recalls the Gothic grandeur of the Great Crusade era, with buttressed towers, stained glass windows depicting imperial saints and historic victories, and gilded aquilas adorning every significant structure. Here, the nobility conduct their affairs in chambers decorated with imported luxuries from across the sector. Elysian wine, Tallarn carpets, furniture crafted from real wood rather than the pressed corpse starch composite used everywhere else. The contrast between spire and underhive represents perhaps the starkest divide in imperial society. While nobles in the upper reaches debate matters of trade agreements and marriage alliances over meals featuring actual meat and fresh vegetables, the workers who produce the hive's output exist in conditions that would have been considered intolerable even during old Earth's most oppressive industrial periods. The main hive, the kilometer's thick mass of structure between the spires and the underhive, houses the manufactorums where the real work of the Imperium occurs. Assembly lines stretch for hundreds of meters, illuminated by flickering lumens that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. The air reeks of promethium fumes, ozone from arc welders, and the sharp chemical tang of industrial solvents. A typical manufactorum worker begins their shift when the klaxons sound, a discordant wail that echoes through the hab blocks and drags millions from their sleeping pallets simultaneously. These hab blocks pack families into single rooms measuring perhaps 4 meters by 3, with a communal waste reclamation facility serving an entire floor of several hundred residents. Privacy does not exist as a practical concept for the majority of hive dwellers. Children sleep beneath their parents' pallets, and multiple generations often share the same cramped space. The walls, constructed from rockcrete mixed with whatever filler materials were cheapest during that particular construction phase, sweat with condensation from the bodies packed inside and the moisture that pervades the hive's recycled atmosphere. The journey to the manufactorum involves navigating transit tubes and conveyor systems that move workers in bulk. These conveyors, essentially massive belts that carry standing workers at a steady pace through the hive's arterial passages, operate continuously. Workers step on at designated points and step off at their assigned manufactorum entrance, the entire process designed for efficiency rather than comfort or safety. Falls from conveyors account for thousands of deaths annually in any major hive, but the administratum considers this an acceptable loss rate given the alternative of individual transit systems. Inside the manufactorums, the work varies depending on the hive's industrial specialty, but the conditions remain universally brutal. On Armageddon, workers assemble components for Chimera armored transports and Leman Russ battle tanks, their hands covered in chemical burns from the industrial adhesives used to seal armor plate joints. On Necromunda, the largest hive world in the Segmentum Solar, workers process raw ore into refined metals, breathing air so thick with particulate matter that their lungs turn black within years of beginning work. Respiratory diseases kill more hive workers than any other single cause, though industrial accidents run a close second. The work shift itself typically runs 12 to 16 hours, depending on production quotas and the foreman's interpretation of imperial labor codes. These codes, dating back thousands of years and interpreted differently on every hive world, theoretically provide workers with certain protections and rest periods. In practice, foremen who fail to meet production quotas face punishment from the administratum overseers, creating an incentive structure that prioritizes output over worker welfare. Servitors, those unfortunate souls who have been lobotomized and augmented with mechanical components to serve as organic robots, handle the most dangerous tasks. Their presence serves as a constant reminder to workers of what awaits those who fail the Imperium too severely. Criminals, heretics, and those who accumulate too many infractions in the manufactorums often find themselves on the servitor conversion tables, their humanity stripped away to create more efficient tools. Compensation for this labor comes primarily in the form of ration tickets rather than actual currency. These tickets, stamped with the administratum's seal and tracked through vast ledgers maintained by scribes who spend their entire lives updating production and distribution records, can be exchanged at designated distribution centers for food, water, and basic necessities. The standard ration for a manufactorum worker consists largely of corpse starch, a processed food product created from recycled organic matter. The Imperium's efficiency extends even to death. Bodies of deceased workers are collected by the Corpse Guild and processed in rendering plants that extract every usable molecule. The resulting gray-brown blocks have the consistency of compressed sawdust and taste vaguely of chemicals and decay, but they provide sufficient calories and nutrients to keep a worker functional. Water, that most basic necessity, becomes a precious commodity in hive cities, where natural water sources were exhausted or contaminated millennia ago. Reclamation plants process sewage, industrial runoff, and even moisture extracted from the air itself, running it through filtration systems that remove most but not all contaminants. The water that emerges tastes of metal and chlorine, and chronic consumption leads to various ailments that hive dwellers simply accept as part of life. The wealthy in the spires drink water that has been distilled multiple times and flavored with imported additives, while underhive residents often resort to collecting condensation from pipes or purchasing dubious liquids from black market dealers. The underhive itself exists as a separate world beneath the main hive structure, a lawless realm where imperial authority barely penetrates. These lowest levels, built on the compressed ruins of earlier settlements, stretch down into darkness lit only by scattered lumens, chemical fires, and the bioluminescent fungi that grows on every damp surface. The underhive houses those who have fallen through the cracks of hive society, workers who lost their positions due to injury or redundancy, criminals fleeing Arbites justice, mutants whose deformities make them unemployable in legitimate industries, and entire communities that have existed outside official records for generations. Gang warfare dominates underhive existence. Organizations like the Goliath gangs of Necromunda, their members enhanced with illegal muscle grafts and combat stims, fight territorial wars against the tech-scavenging Orlocks and the psychotic Escher gangs for control of valuable resources. These resources might be a functioning water pipe, access to a transit tube that reaches the upper hive, or a cache of weapons left over from some long-forgotten conflict. The gangs operate under their own codes and hierarchies, often more organized than official imperial governance in these depths. A gang leader, or boss, commands absolute loyalty from their fighters, and betrayal results in execution that serves as entertainment and warning to others. The violence in the Underhive follows no schedule or rules of engagement. Ambushes occur in the maze like passages between collapsed structures, with attackers using autoguns, stub pistols, and improvised weapons crafted from scavenged materials. Bodies are left where they fall, adding to the archaeological layers of the Underhive as new construction and debris gradually bury them. The gangs occasionally venture into the main hive to conduct raids or sell their services as muscle for hire, but most confine their activities to the depths where the Arbites rarely patrol. The Adeptus Arbites maintain fortress precincts in hive cities, imposing structures of armored rockcrete that stand as islands of imperial law. The Arbites concern themselves primarily with threats to imperial authority rather than common crime. A murder in the Underhive warrants no response, but an organized resistance movement or cult activity brings down the full weight of Arbites' justice. Their response to such threats involves overwhelming force. Arbites in carapace armor, carrying shotguns and shock mauls, supported by repressor armored vehicles equipped with riot cannons and dozer blades. They cordon off entire sectors, conduct mass arrests, and execute suspects on the spot if evidence of heresy or rebellion is found. The Arbites make no distinction between active participants and bystanders. Anyone in a condemned sector is guilty by association. The constant threat of chaos cult infiltration haunts every hive city. The sheer population density and miserable conditions create fertile ground for chaos worship. A cult might begin with a single worker who discovers a forbidden text in the Underhive or experiences a vision during a psychotic break induced by chemical exposure and exhaustion. They recruit others with promises of power, purpose, or simply an end to their suffering. These cults grow in the shadows, meeting in abandoned sections of the hive or chambers carved into the walls beyond official maps. They conduct rituals that draw on the warp, offering sacrifices to the ruinous powers in exchange for dark blessings. When a cult grows large enough or bold enough to reveal itself, the response is swift and merciless. The Arbites coordinate with the Adeptus Ministorum, and if the threat is severe enough, the Inquisition itself. Entire hab blocks are purged with flame, the residents burned alive in their homes to ensure no taint remains. The ecclesiarchy's preachers arrive afterward to sanctify the site and remind survivors of the price of straying from the Emperor's light. The bodies are rendered into corpse starch like any other organic waste, the Imperium's efficiency extending even to its enemies. Genestealer infestations represent an even more insidious threat. These Xenos organisms, the vanguard of Tyranid hive fleets, infiltrate hive cities and implant their genetic material in human hosts. The infected feel an overwhelming compulsion to reproduce, passing the genestealer taint to their offspring. First-generation hybrids are obvious monsters, but subsequent generations appear increasingly human while retaining their alien loyalty. By the fourth generation, the hybrids are nearly indistinguishable from normal humans, allowing them to infiltrate every level of hive society. They form cults that worship the star children, awaiting the day when the hive fleet arrives to consume the planet. These genestealer cults can remain hidden for decades or even centuries, slowly spreading through the population. They place their members in positions of authority, administratum clerks who alter records, Arbites officers who misdirect investigations, even planetary defense force officers who will sabotage defenses when the time comes. The cult's psychic connection to the Patriarch, the original genestealer, coordinates their activities with inhuman patience. When the hive fleet finally arrives in orbit, the cult rises up in a coordinated uprising, sabotaging defenses and opening gates to let the Tyranid organisms flood into the hive. Infrastructure decay presents a constant crisis in hive cities that have stood for thousands of years. The lower levels contain systems installed so long ago that no one remembers their original purpose or how to properly maintain them. Plasma conduits that power entire sectors run through passages no human has entered in millennia, their maintenance performed by servitors following programming created by engineers dead for generations. When these systems fail, entire sectors lose power, water, or atmosphere recycling, and thousands or millions die before repairs can be effected. The air recycling systems that make hive life possible operate on a scale difficult to comprehend. Massive atmospheric processors, some the size of city blocks, draw in the toxic external atmosphere and process it through bacterial filters, chemical scrubbers, and electrostatic precipitators to produce something humans can breathe. These systems require constant maintenance and regular replacement of components that wear out or become clogged with the accumulated filth of billions of people living in close proximity. The air that emerges still contains elevated levels of industrial pollutants, but it provides sufficient oxygen to sustain life, which is all the Imperium requires. Water reclamation follows similar principles of brutal efficiency. Every drop of liquid in a hive is precious and must be recycled endlessly. Sewage flows through pipes to processing plants where solid waste is separated and sent to rendering facilities while the liquid undergoes treatment. Industrial runoff from manufactorums, laden with heavy metals and chemical contaminants, receives separate processing to extract valuable materials before the water is cleaned enough to re-enter the supply system. The entire cycle operates continuously, and any significant disruption can trigger a cascade of failures that leaves millions without water within hours. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus maintain nominal oversight of the most critical systems, but even their resources are stretched thin across the Imperium's countless hive worlds. They focus on the manufactorums and the systems directly related to production, leaving much of the basic infrastructure to local maintenance guilds who work with incomplete knowledge and inadequate tools. These guilds pass down their knowledge through apprenticeship, with techniques and prayers to the machine spirits handed from master to apprentice across generations. Much of what they do amounts to cargo cult maintenance, performing rituals they believe keep the machines functioning without truly understanding the underlying technology. The vast majority of humanity in the 41st millennium never sees a hive city or walks the corridors of a starship. Instead, billions upon billions toil in fields that stretch beyond the horizon, their lives dedicated to producing the food that keeps the Imperium's teeming populations from starvation. Agri-worlds represent the Imperium's solution to the fundamental problem of feeding 1 million worlds, many of which cannot produce sufficient food for their own populations. These planets have been systematically stripped of their original ecosystems and converted into monocrop factories operating on a planetary scale, their entire biospheres subordinated to the single purpose of maximum agricultural output. The transformation of a world into an agri-world begins with comprehensive ecological destruction. Native flora and fauna are eradicated through a combination of defoliants, biological agents, and simple mechanical clearing. The Adeptus Mechanicus conducts surveys to determine which Terran crop species will produce optimal yields in the local soil and climate conditions. Then seeds are distributed across entire continents. Within a generation, worlds that once hosted complex ecosystems featuring thousands of species become oceans of wheat, corpse starch feedstock plants, or nutri-grain that extends from pole to pole, interrupted only by the processing facilities and transit hubs necessary to collect and ship the harvest. The scale of these agricultural operations defies easy comprehension. On a typical agri-world, individual fields measure hundreds of kilometers across, tended by massive agricultural machinery that operates around the clock during growing seasons. Harvester combines the size of hab blocks crawl across the landscape on tracks that leave furrows deep enough to swallow a man, their cutting mechanisms capable of processing thousands of tons of grain per hour. These machines, like all Imperial technology, are maintained through a combination of practical engineering and religious ritual. Tech priests from the local Mechanicus shrine perform the proper benedictions and anoint critical components with sacred oils, while servitors handle the actual mechanical repairs. The human population of agri-worlds exists primarily as indentured labor, bound to the land through debt contracts that extend across generations. A family might owe their service because an ancestor accepted a loan to purchase farming equipment or to pay medical expenses. and the compound interest ensures the debt can never be fully repaid. These workers live in settlements scattered across the agricultural zones, typically consisting of prefabricated hab units that provide basic shelter but little else. The settlements lack the infrastructure found in hive cities. Water comes from wells or irrigation channels. Waste disposal involves simple septic systems or even open latrines, and power is rationed strictly based on agricultural necessity rather than human comfort. The work cycle on an agri-world follows the growing seasons with brutal efficiency. During planting season, workers spend 16-hour days operating seeding equipment, performing manual planting in areas the machines cannot reach, and maintaining the irrigation systems that keep the crops alive. The administratum sets quotas based on historical yields and projected imperial needs, with no consideration for local conditions or crop failures. A drought, pest infestation, or disease outbreak does not reduce the expected tithe. It simply means the workers must labor harder to meet the same numbers or face the consequences of failure. Servitors handle much of the most dangerous or monotonous work. These lobotomized cyborgs, their human brains reduced to organic processors running simple programming, operate sprayer equipment that distributes pesticides and fertilizers across the fields. The chemicals they spray are frequently toxic to unmodified humans, but servitors feel no discomfort as the compounds burn their exposed skin or corrode their respiratory systems. When a servitor fails, it is simply replaced with another converted from the local criminal population or from workers who suffered injuries that made them unable to perform their regular duties. The fertilizers and pesticides used on agri-worlds represent another expression of imperial efficiency taken to its logical extreme. Chemical plants on the planet's surface or in orbit produce compounds designed for maximum effectiveness rather than safety or environmental impact. Runoff from treated fields contaminates groundwater, killing any remaining native species and rendering entire regions toxic to unprotected human life. The workers themselves suffer from chronic exposure, developing cancers, neurological disorders, and genetic damage that manifests in their children. The administratum considers this an acceptable cost. Workers who become too ill to perform their duties are converted into servitors or rendered down into corpse starch, their bodies contributing to the food supply they spent their lives producing. Harvest season brings the most intense period of labor. The crops must be gathered within a specific window to prevent spoilage, and every available worker is pressed into service. Children as young as 6 or 7 work alongside adults, gathering crops the machines miss or sorting grain in the processing facilities. Accidents during harvest season kill thousands annually on any major agri-world. Workers fall into machinery, are crushed beneath harvester treads, or simply collapse from exhaustion and are left where they lie until the work is complete. The overseers, minor administratum officials who manage the day-to-day operations, carry stub pistols and shock prods to motivate workers who slow down or attempt to rest before their shift ends. The processing facilities where harvested crops are prepared for shipment operate continuously during harvest season. Grain must be dried, sorted, and sealed in massive storage containers designed for transport on bulk cargo haulers. On worlds that produce protein crops, slaughterhouses process livestock that have been raised in conditions even more cramped and miserable than those endured by the human population. The animals, often genetically modified for rapid growth and maximum meat yield, live their entire lives in pens where they cannot turn around, fed processed feed, and pumped full of growth hormones until they reach slaughter weight. The butchering process is mechanized and efficient, with conveyor systems moving carcasses through stations where servitors and human workers perform specific cuts with practiced precision. The imperial tithe represents an absolute obligation that supersedes any local considerations. When the tithe ships arrive in orbit, they must be filled to capacity regardless of circumstances on the ground. The administratum calculates the required tithe based on the world's classification and historical production records, adjusted periodically based on reports that may be years or decades out of date. A world that experienced a particularly good harvest a generation ago might find itself locked into tithe requirements it can no longer meet due to soil depletion, climate shifts, or simple bureaucratic error. The planetary governor and their administrators face a stark choice: meet the tithe or face execution for failure to fulfill their imperial obligations. This system creates situations where entire planetary populations starve, while their harvest is loaded onto ships bound for hive worlds or military supply depots. The workers who planted, tended, and harvested the crops watch as every grain of their labor is seized, leaving them with nothing but the minimal rations the administratum deems necessary to keep them alive until the next planting season. Protests or resistance are met with summary execution. The Arbites maintain a presence on major agri-worlds specifically to deal with such incidents, and their response to food riots involves mass shootings and public hangings designed to terrorize the population into compliance. Some agri-worlds specialize in livestock rather than crops, their surfaces covered in ranches that extend across continents. These worlds raise groks, large quadrupedal creatures prized for their meat and hide, in herds numbering in the millions. The groks herders live even more isolated lives than crop farmers, spending months at a time in the wilderness with only their animals for company. They drive the herds between grazing areas following routes established millennia ago, sleeping in the open or in crude shelters, and defending their charges from native predators that survived the initial ecological purge. When the tithe collectors arrive, they simply take entire herds, leaving the herders with breeding stock barely sufficient to rebuild their numbers before the next collection. Feudal worlds represent a different approach to imperial resource extraction, though the end result for the inhabitants differs little from that experienced on agri-worlds. These planets maintain technology levels equivalent to pre-industrial Terra, with populations organized into rigid hierarchical societies ruled by noble houses. The Adeptus Mechanicus enforces this technological stagnation through a combination of religious doctrine and practical monopoly on advanced technology. The tech priests teach that the machine god has ordained a specific level of technological development for each world, and to exceed that level without proper sanction constitutes tech heresy punishable by death. The typical feudal world features a landscape of castles, fortified manor houses, and peasant villages that would not look out of place in Terra's medieval period. The nobility, descended from the original colonists or conquerors who claimed the world for the Imperium, rule over vast estates worked by peasant populations bound to the land through feudal obligations. These peasants farm using methods that have remained unchanged for thousands of years: wooden plows pulled by draft animals, hand tools for harvesting, and simple irrigation systems maintained through communal labor. The yields are far lower than those achieved on agri-worlds with their mechanized agriculture, but the administratum considers this acceptable given the minimal infrastructure investment required. The feudal hierarchy mirrors imperial structure in miniature. At the apex sits the planetary governor, typically the most powerful noble house's patriarch, who owes allegiance directly to the sector governor and through them to Terra itself. Below the planetary governor, various noble houses control regions or provinces, their authority derived from ancient charters and maintained through military force. These nobles maintain retinues of knights, professional warriors equipped with the best weapons and armor available at the local technology level. On some feudal worlds, these knights ride into battle on horseback, wearing plate armor and carrying lances, an absurd sight in an age of orbital bombardment and plasma weapons, yet they serve their purpose in maintaining order among populations that have never seen such advanced technology. The peasant population understands their world through a lens of profound ignorance and superstition. They know nothing of the broader Imperium beyond what the ecclesiarchy's priests tell them, and the priests carefully control the narrative. The emperor becomes a distant god-king who demands obedience and tribute. The stars in the sky are the souls of the faithful watching over humanity, and the occasional shuttle or aircraft that passes overhead is an angel or demon, depending on whether it belongs to imperial authorities or represents a threat. This ignorance serves as a tool of control more effective than any weapon. A population that does not know alternatives exist cannot conceive of rebellion against the established order. The Ministorum maintains a strong presence on feudal worlds, with cathedrals and shrines in every significant settlement. The priests serve multiple functions. They provide spiritual guidance, record births and deaths for their administratum's tithes, and identify psychers for collection by the black ships. They also reinforce the social hierarchy through religious doctrine, teaching that the nobles rule by the emperor's will, and that the peasants serve the emperor through their obedience to their lords. Saints' days and religious festivals provide the only breaks in the grinding routine of agricultural labor, and the peasants celebrate these occasions with genuine fervor born from lives that offer little else to anticipate. The imperial tithe on feudal worlds takes multiple forms. Food production represents the primary obligation, with each estate required to deliver a specific quantity of grain, livestock, or other agricultural products to the planetary governor's collectors. The collectors arrive with armed guards, weigh and inspect the tribute, and execute estate managers who attempt to cheat the count. The tithe also includes manpower. Feudal worlds serve as recruiting grounds for the Imperial Guard, with the nobility required to provide a certain number of able-bodied men when the tithe ships arrive. These conscripts are marched to the landing fields, loaded onto bulk transports, and shipped off-world to training facilities, where they will be transformed into Imperial Guardsmen. Most will never return, dying on battlefields light years from their home fighting enemies they cannot comprehend in wars whose causes they will never understand. The isolation maintained on feudal worlds extends beyond simple lack of technology. The administratum and mechanicus actively suppress knowledge that might upset the social order. Books are rare and closely controlled, with literacy confined to the nobility and priesthood. The peasants pass down their knowledge orally, through songs and stories that encode practical information about farming, weather prediction, and local history. This oral tradition accumulates errors and mythologization over generations, until actual historical events become indistinguishable from legend. A peasant might believe their world was founded by a golden giant who descended from the sky riding a chariot of fire, not knowing they are describing a garbled account of a space marine deployment during the Great Crusade 10,000 years ago. Some feudal worlds maintain this state due to deliberate policy rather than simple technological limitation. The administratum has determined that certain populations are more compliant and easier to manage when kept at pre-industrial technology levels. These worlds produce reliable tithes, rarely experience serious rebellion, and provide steady streams of recruits for the Imperial Guard who adapt well to military discipline due to their cultural conditioning toward obedience to authority. The cost in human potential and innovation is irrelevant. The Imperium does not need every world to advance technologically. It needs them to fulfill their assigned roles in the vast machine of imperial governance. The Astra Militarum, known colloquially as the Imperial Guard, stands as the Imperium's primary military force and the largest organized fighting body in galactic history. Numbering in the countless billions, spread across 1 million worlds and thousands of active war zones, the Guard represents humanity's answer to threats that would otherwise overwhelm individual planets or sectors. Where the Adeptus Astartes serve as the Emperor's scalpel, striking with precision at critical targets, the Imperial Guard functions as his sledgehammer, crushing enemies through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The doctrine is simple and has remained unchanged for 10 millennia. When faced with any threat, deploy enough soldiers with enough guns until the problem is solved or every last guardsman is dead. The Adeptus Munitorum, the vast administrative organ responsible for managing the Imperial Guard, operates from Terra and maintains fortress-sized offices on every sector capital world. Their scribes and administrators track troop movements, equipment allocations, and casualty reports with obsessive detail, though the sheer scale of operations means their records are perpetually years out of date and riddled with errors. The Munitorum calculates each world's guard tithe based on population, industrial capacity, and strategic importance, then issues demands that must be met regardless of local circumstances. A hive world might be required to provide 50 million conscripts every decade, while a feudal world contributes a few thousand knights and men at arms. The method of selection varies by world, but the result remains constant. Young men and women are taken from their homes and shipped off-world to fight in wars they do not understand for causes that mean nothing to them personally. Recruitment on hive worlds typically involves press-ganging operations conducted by local enforcers working under Munitorum authority. They sweep through hab blocks and manufactorum districts, seizing anyone who meets basic physical requirements and lacks sufficient connections to avoid conscription. The unemployed masses, those who lost their positions due to injury or redundancy, represent prime targets. Gang members captured during Arbites raids find themselves given a choice between execution and service in the Guard. Petty criminals are marched from detention cells directly to mustering grounds. The wealthy can purchase exemptions or arrange for substitutes, ensuring that Guard regiments draw primarily from the lowest social strata, where individual lives hold minimal value. On feudal worlds, the nobility fulfill their tithe obligations by conscripting peasants from their estates, selecting the strongest and healthiest for military service. These conscripts often view Guard service as an opportunity for advancement impossible in their rigid home societies, not yet understanding that the average lifespan of a Guardsman in active combat measures in hours rather than years. Some worlds maintain proud military traditions where service in the Guard represents an honor, and volunteers step forward eagerly. The Cadian regiments, drawn from the fortress world that stood watch over the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years before its destruction, produced soldiers who began weapons training as children and considered Guard service their sacred duty. The Death Corps of Krieg, recruited from a world that destroyed itself in atomic fire during a civil war, sends regiments of fanatical soldiers who view death in the Emperor's service as the only redemption for their world's ancient sin. The journey from recruitment to deployment involves processing through training facilities that transform civilians into soldiers through methods that prioritize speed and uniformity over individual skill development. A typical training cycle lasts between 8 and 16 weeks, during which recruits learn basic weapons handling, squad tactics, and the absolute necessity of obedience to orders. Commissars oversee the training, their bolt pistols and power swords serving as constant reminders of the price of failure or cowardice. Recruits who cannot keep pace with the training regimen are either assigned to support roles, or if their failure is deemed willful, executed as examples to their fellows. The standard equipment issued to Imperial Guardsmen reflects the Imperium's approach to military logistics: simple, reliable, and mass-producible. The lasgun, known officially as the M36 lasgun, but existing in thousands of pattern variations across the Imperium, serves as the primary infantry weapon. This laser rifle operates on rechargeable power cells that can be restored through exposure to sunlight, open flames, or electrical sources, making it ideal for extended campaigns where resupply proves difficult. The Law's bolt it fires can punch through standard body armor and cauterizes wounds as it burns through flesh. The weapon's effectiveness drops significantly against heavier armor or Xenos with natural resilience, but the Guard's doctrine accounts for this through volume of fire. A single lasgun might only annoy an orc, but 100 lasguns firing in coordinated volleys will bring down even the largest greenskin. Guardsmen wear flak armor, layered synthetic materials designed to stop shrapnel and glancing blows while remaining light enough for extended wear. The armor provides minimal protection against direct hits from most weapons Guardsmen face in combat, but it costs little to produce and allows soldiers to maintain mobility. The standard uniform includes a helmet, combat fatigues in colors appropriate to the regiment's traditional scheme, and a rucksack containing basic supplies: ration bars, water purification tablets, entrenching tools, spare power cells, and a copy of the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer. This last item, a small book issued to every Guardsman, contains basic tactical information, prayers to the Emperor, and propaganda designed to maintain morale in the face of horrors that would break an unprepared mind. Regiment organization follows patterns established during the Great Crusade, with each regiment typically numbering between 2,000 and 5,000 soldiers divided into companies, platoons, and squads. The Munitorum raises regiments from single worlds to maintain cultural cohesion and esprit de corps, believing that soldiers who share a common origin will fight more effectively together. This practice also prevents regiments from developing divided loyalties or becoming susceptible to local political influences during extended deployments. A regiment raised on Cadia consists entirely of Cadians, led by Cadian officers, maintaining Cadian traditions and tactics. When that regiment deploys to a war zone light years from their home world, they bring their culture with them, creating islands of their home world's identity in whatever hell they find themselves fighting. The one-way nature of guard service becomes apparent once regiments deploy to active war zones. The Munitorum does not maintain infrastructure for returning soldiers to their home worlds. The cost of warp travel and the strategic necessity of keeping experienced soldiers in the field means that guardsmen serve until they die or become physically incapable of fighting. A soldier who survives one campaign finds themselves immediately redeployed to another war zone, then another, until eventually they fall to enemy fire, disease, or simple exhaustion. Veterans who survive multiple campaigns become increasingly rare and valuable, their experience making them natural leaders, but the attrition rate ensures that few guardsmen live long enough to accumulate significant experience. Life in active war zones varies dramatically depending on the nature of the conflict and the enemy being fought. Campaigns against orc infestations often devolve into grinding attritional warfare, where Imperial forces must kill every last greenskin to prevent the Xenos from regenerating their numbers. The orcs themselves present a horrifying enemy, massive humanoid creatures with green skin and tusked jaws, driven by an instinctive love of violence and equipped with crude but effective weapons. An orc boy stands taller and broader than a human, with muscle density that allows it to shrug off wounds that would kill a man instantly. Their weapons, cobbled together from scrap metal and operating on principles that defy rational understanding, fire massive caliber rounds or spray gouts of flame with gleeful disregard for accuracy. Orc mobs charge Imperial lines with suicidal enthusiasm, their numbers and resilience allowing them to close to melee range, where their natural strength gives them devastating advantage. Fighting orcs requires guardsmen to maintain disciplined fire lines, pouring La's fire into the oncoming horde, while heavy weapons teams target the largest specimens with auto cannons and las cannons. The noise of an orc assault is overwhelming, the thunderous boom of their crude firearms, their bellowing war cries in their brutal language, and the screams of guardsmen who disappear beneath the green tide. When orcs break through Imperial lines, the result is a massacre. Guardsmen armed with lasguns and bayonets cannot stand against creatures that can tear a man in half with their bare hands. The only response is immediate counter-attack or retreat, and the commissariat ensures that retreat happens only when ordered. Chaos cultist uprisings present a different kind of horror. These enemies are human, or were human before their corruption, making them both familiar and deeply wrong. Cultists fight with a fanatical devotion born from genuine religious fervor rather than simple indoctrination. They believe the dark gods will reward their service with power and immortality, and this belief makes them fearless in ways that surpass even the most dedicated Imperial soldier. Cultist forces include corrupted planetary defense force units with proper military training and equipment, frenzied mobs armed with improvised weapons, and empowered by warp spawn mutations, and the truly damned who have transformed into something no longer recognizably human. The presence of chaos on a battlefield brings phenomena that break the laws of reality. Guardsmen watch as their comrades suddenly burst into flames from within, their bodies serving as gateways for demonic entities. The air itself can become hostile, whispering temptations and lies that erode sanity and discipline. Psychers among the cultist forces hurl bolts of warp energy that liquefy targets or cause their heads to explode from psychic pressure. The commissariat shoots any guardsman who shows signs of corruption or whose mind breaks under the psychic assault, because a corrupted soldier represents a threat to the entire regiment. Better to execute a dozen men who might have recovered than risk one becoming a vector for demonic possession. Tyrannid invasions force guardsmen to confront an enemy that operates with perfect coordination and views humanity as nothing more than biomass to be consumed. The Tyranids attack in swarms that blot out the sky, their lesser organisms serving as living ammunition for the larger creatures. Hormagaunts, scuttling monsters with blade-like claws, sprint toward Imperial lines faster than a human can run, their numbers measured in thousands. Termagants follow behind, firing living ammunition from the weapons fused to their bodies. The larger creatures, warriors that stand twice as tall as a man and carnifexes that resemble living tanks, shrug off lasgun fire and require concentrated heavy weapons fire to bring down. The Tyranids feel no fear, take no prisoners, and cannot be negotiated with. They exist only to feed, and every human body they consume adds to their biomass, allowing them to spawn more organisms. The psychological impact of facing Tyranids breaks soldiers in ways other enemies do not. An orc can be killed and stays dead. A cultist bleeds when shot, but the Tyranids represent an endless tide of alien hunger that adapts to whatever tactics the Imperium employs. Guardsmen watch as their lasgun fire, which might have been effective in earlier engagements, becomes useless as the Tyranids evolve thicker carapaces. They see fallen comrades dragged away by rippers, small creatures that swarm over bodies and reduce them to component molecules within minutes. The knowledge that death means becoming food for the hive fleet, that their very atoms will be recycled into new Tyranid organisms, creates a special kind of horror. The commissariat exists to maintain discipline and ensure that guardsmen fight regardless of the odds or their personal fear. Commissars, drawn from the Schola Progenium, where orphans of imperial servants receive education in absolute loyalty to the Imperium, hold authority to execute any soldier for cowardice, heresy, or failure to obey orders. They wear distinctive long coats and peaked caps, and carry bolt pistols and power swords as symbols of their office. A commissar walks behind advancing lines, watching for any sign of wavering. A guardsman who hesitates, who takes cover when ordered to advance, or who suggests retreat without authorization, receives a bolt round to the back of the head. The commissar then steps over the corpse and orders the advance to continue, the execution serving as motivation for the other soldiers to keep moving forward. The practice of decimation, executing every 10th man in a unit that has failed in its duties, represents the commissariat's most extreme disciplinary measure. When an entire company breaks and runs or fails to hold a position they were ordered to defend, the commissar lines up the survivors and counts them off. Every 10th man is shot, regardless of their individual performance during the engagement. The survivors understand that their continued existence depends on their unit's success, creating group pressure to maintain discipline, even when individual soldiers might prefer to flee. This brutal calculus trades immediate casualties for long-term effectiveness, sacrificing some soldiers to ensure the rest fight harder. Veterans who survive multiple campaigns develop a fatalistic outlook that allows them to function in conditions that would paralyze fresh recruits. They learn to sleep during artillery bombardments, to eat their rations while surrounded by corpses, and to maintain their equipment with mechanical precision, because a jammed lasgun means death. These veterans become squad leaders and platoon sergeants, their experience invaluable for keeping inexperienced soldiers alive long enough to gain their own experience. They develop superstitions and rituals, always checking their weapon in a specific sequence, never sleeping in the same position twice, refusing to learn the names of new replacements until those soldiers survive their first engagement. The veterans know that attachment to comrades who will likely die within days serves no purpose except to create additional grief. The Munitorum's logistics system attempts to keep guard regiments supplied with ammunition, food, and replacement equipment, but the vast distances and communication delays inherent in galactic-scale operations mean supplies often arrive late or not at all. Regiments learn to scavenge from battlefields, stripping usable equipment from the dead of both sides. A guardsman might carry a lasgun manufactured on their home world, wear a flak vest taken from a corpse 3 campaigns ago, and eat rations stamped with production dates from before they were born. The guard's supply situation improves when they fight alongside Space Marine chapters, or when the Adeptus Mechanicus maintains a significant presence, but most regiments operate in a state of perpetual shortage, making do with whatever they can acquire through official channels or improvisation. Medical care in the Guard exists primarily to return wounded soldiers to combat effectiveness rather than to preserve life or reduce suffering. Field medics carry basic supplies: counterseptic, synthized skin to seal wounds, stims to keep injured soldiers conscious and fighting, and mercy blades for those too damaged to save. A guardsman who loses a limb might receive a crude augmetic replacement if the regiment has access to a mechanicus facility, or they might simply be declared unfit for combat and left at whatever field hospital exists in the rear areas. These hospitals warehouse the maimed and broken, soldiers who can no longer fight but whom the munitorum has not yet processed for servitor conversion or other uses. Some eventually recover enough to serve in support roles. Most simply wait to die, their bodies worn out by combat and the infections that fester in wounds treated with inadequate supplies. The absence of any retirement system means guardsmen serve until death claims them through enemy action, disease, or simple age. A soldier who somehow survives decades of continuous combat finds themselves still marching to the next war zone, their body held together by scar tissue and augmetics, their mind damaged by experiences no human should endure. These rare individuals, veterans of a dozen campaigns or more, become legends within their regiments, living proof that survival is possible even in the grinding meat grinder of imperial warfare. They train new recruits when circumstances allow, passing on hard-won knowledge of how to dig a proper fighting position, how to recognize the signs of an imminent enemy assault, and how to keep functioning when every instinct screams to run. The Guard fights its wars in environments that range from frozen ice worlds, where exposed skin freezes solid within seconds, to jungle death worlds, where the native flora proves as dangerous as any enemy. Guardsmen dig trenches in toxic ash wastes, their respirators clogging with caustic dust. They garrison fortress cities under siege for years, eating rats and corpse starch while artillery pounds their positions. They conduct urban warfare in hive cities where every building might contain enemy ambushes, where the civilians cannot be distinguished from hostiles, and where the fighting reduces entire districts to rubble that must be cleared building by building, room by room. They assault fortified positions across open ground, running through fields of razor wire and minefields, while enemy fire cuts down entire platoons, because the munitorum has determined that position must be taken regardless of cost. The doctrine of attrition warfare that guides Imperial Guard strategy treats human life as the most abundant and therefore most expendable resource. When faced with a fortified enemy position, the standard response involves preliminary artillery bombardment followed by mass infantry assault. The first waves die to mines, automated defenses, and enemy fire, but they reveal the positions of enemy weapons and exhaust their ammunition. Subsequent waves advance over the bodies of their comrades, each assault pushing slightly further, until eventually the position is overrun through sheer weight of numbers. A fortress that could withstand any reasonable assault falls when the Imperium commits millions of soldiers to taking it, accepting casualties that would be considered catastrophic losses by any other military force. The Adeptus Mechanicus stands apart from the rest of the Imperium, a techno-religious organization that predates the current imperial structure and maintains a degree of autonomy that would be considered heretical if claimed by any other institution. Their domain centers on Mars, the red planet that served as humanity's first off-world colony during the Age of Technology and now functions as the Imperium's primary forge world. The surface of Mars bears little resemblance to the planet that ancient Terran colonists first settled. Millennia of industrial exploitation have transformed it into a landscape of massive manufactorums, plasma reactors, and mining operations that extend deep into the planetary crust. The thin atmosphere, already barely breathable in ancient times, now consists primarily of industrial effluent and radioactive particles that would kill an unprotected human within minutes. The cult Mechanicus emerged during Old Night, the age of terror and isolation that followed the collapse of human civilization during the Age of Strife. Cut off from Terra and facing the complete breakdown of the technology that made their world habitable, the people of Mars turned to worship of the very machines that kept them alive. This worship evolved into a complex theological framework that views all technology as sacred, all knowledge as holy, and the pursuit of understanding as a religious calling. The machine god, known as the Omnissiah, became the central figure of their faith. When the Emperor arrived on Mars during the early days of the Great Crusade, the Mechanicus recognized him as the physical manifestation of the Omnissiah, a compromise that allowed the two powers to forge the Treaty of Mars that bound them together while preserving Mechanicus independence. The tech priests of Mars view machines not as tools, but as living entities possessed of machine spirits that must be appeased through proper ritual and maintenance. This belief system, which might seem like superstition to an outsider, contains kernels of truth that make it more than simple religious dogma. Many pieces of imperial technology incorporate elements that modern tech priests do not fully understand, relics from the dark age of technology, when humanity's scientific knowledge reached heights that current civilization cannot match. The machine spirits they pray to might be sophisticated artificial intelligence systems, quantum computational matrices, or phenomena that blur the line between technology and the warp itself. The rituals of activation, the prayers spoken while performing maintenance, and the sacred oils applied to mechanisms often correspond to actual technical procedures whose underlying principles have been forgotten, but whose practical application remains effective. The standard template construct systems represent the holy grail of Mechanicus archaeology and exploration. These legendary devices, created during the dark age of technology, contained complete manufacturing specifications for everything human civilization might need to establish itself on new worlds. An intact SDC could provide blueprints for agricultural equipment, power generation systems, weapons, vehicles, and all the infrastructure necessary for human survival and prosperity. The templates were designed to be comprehensible to users with minimal technical knowledge, allowing colonists to maintain and repair their equipment even after generations of isolation from the broader human civilization. The vast majority of SDCs were lost during the Age of Strife, destroyed in the wars and catastrophes that shattered human civilization. The few fragments that survive are treated as sacred relics, and the discovery of even a partial SDC printout can justify decades of Mechanicus exploration and the expenditure of enormous resources. The most complete SDC fragments in Mechanicus possession provide the templates for equipment that forms the backbone of imperial military power. The Rhino armored transport, the Land Raider battle tank, and the various patterns of Space Marine power armor all derive from SDC designs. The fact that these templates exist explains why the Imperium can produce such equipment in vast quantities across thousands of forged worlds. The specifications are complete and detailed enough that even tech priests with limited understanding of the underlying principles can follow them to create functional results. New SDC discoveries are vanishingly rare in the 41st millennium, but when they occur, they can shift the balance of power in entire sectors. A fragment containing designs for more efficient plasma reactors or improved weapon systems becomes the subject of immediate theological debate, political maneuvering, and sometimes outright conflict between different factions of the Mechanicus. The reality of technological stagnation pervades every aspect of imperial civilization, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the Mechanicus itself. The organization that should serve as humanity's engine of innovation has instead become the guardian of orthodoxy, viewing any deviation from established patterns as potential tech heresy. This conservatism stems from bitter historical experience. During the Age of Strife and the Horus Heresy, uncontrolled innovation and experimentation with forbidden technologies led to catastrophic consequences. Artificial intelligence systems that humanity had relied upon turned against their creators in the wars known as the Cybernetic Revolt. Weapons designed to harness the power of the warp instead opened gateways for demonic invasion. The lesson learned, encoded into Mechanicus doctrine, holds that the ancients understood technology in ways current humanity cannot match, and therefore the safest path involves preserving and replicating their designs rather than attempting to improve upon them. This philosophy has calcified into religious law enforced by the Mechanicus priesthood. Tech priests who propose genuine innovations, rather than minor variations on existing patterns risk accusation of tech heresy, a charge that can result in execution, exile to the most dangerous Forge worlds, or lobotomization and conversion into a servitor. The process of gaining approval for even minor modifications to established designs requires navigating a bureaucracy that rivals the administratum in its complexity and resistance to change. A tech priest must present their proposed modification to a council of senior magi, demonstrate that it does not violate the principles of the cult Mechanicus, prove that it improves upon the existing design in measurable ways, and show that it does not incorporate forbidden technologies or principles. This process can take decades, and most proposals die in committee, buried under theological objections and political opposition from factions that benefit from maintaining the status quo. The result is a technological base that decays faster than it can be maintained or restored. Knowledge is lost with each generation as tech priests die taking their understanding with them, their apprentices learning only the rote procedures without grasping the underlying principles. Forge worlds produce equipment using techniques passed down through millennia, but the number of individuals who truly understand how and why these techniques work diminishes constantly. A tech priest might spend their entire life maintaining a plasma reactor, performing the proper rituals, and replacing components according to sacred schedules, without ever understanding the fusion processes that generate the reactor's power. When something goes wrong in an unexpected way, when a machine fails in a manner not covered by the standard liturgies of repair, the tech priest often lacks the knowledge to diagnose and fix the problem. The solution becomes replacing entire systems rather than repairing individual components, a wasteful approach that works only as long as the Forge worlds can continue manufacturing replacements. The Forge worlds themselves exist as monuments to the Mechanicus's power and the price of that power. These planets have been completely given over to industrial production, their entire surfaces covered in manufactorums, refineries, and processing facilities that operate continuously. Forge worlds produce the weapons, vehicles, and equipment that the Imperial Guard and Space Marines require, along with the countless other items necessary for a galaxy-spanning civilization. The output of a major Forge world like Ryza or Greya can equip entire Crusade fleets, but this productivity comes at a cost measured in human suffering and environmental devastation that makes even hive worlds seem pleasant by comparison. The human workers on Forge worlds exist in conditions that blur the line between employment and slavery. The Mechanicus divides its workforce into strict hierarchies based on function and augmentation level. At the bottom sit the menials, baseline humans who perform the simplest and most dangerous tasks. These workers might spend their entire lives feeding raw materials into processing machines, clearing jammed conveyor systems, or hauling components between different sections of a manufactorum. The work exposes them to hazards that kill slowly, radiation from poorly shielded reactors, toxic chemicals used in manufacturing processes, and the simple physical wear of repetitive labor performed for 12 or 16-hour shifts without adequate rest or nutrition. The Mechanicus views the human body as inefficient and prone to failure, a perspective that leads them to augment their workers with crude bionics that prioritize function over the worker's comfort or long-term health. A menial who loses an arm in an industrial accident receives a replacement limb, but this augmetic consists of simple mechanical components with minimal interface to the nervous system. The worker must learn to operate the augmetic through conscious effort, using visible controls or responding to crude sensory feedback that provides only basic information about grip strength and position. These augmetics are built to last and to perform specific industrial tasks, not to restore the worker's quality of life. A menial with augmetic legs can stand at their workstation for entire shifts without tiring, but they cannot run, cannot climb stairs easily, and experience constant low-level pain from the connection points where metal meets flesh. The progression from menial to servitor represents the final degradation of human autonomy on Forge worlds. Servitors are created from criminals, workers who suffer injuries too severe for simple augmetic replacement, and anyone the Mechanicus deems more useful as a programmable organic machine than as a thinking human. The conversion process involves lobotomization, the surgical destruction of higher brain functions that leaves only the brain stem and motor control centers intact. The resulting entity can follow simple programmed instructions, perform repetitive tasks with perfect consistency, and operate in environments that would kill an unmodified human, but it possesses no will, no personality, and no awareness of its condition. The Mechanicus considers this a mercy. The criminal's debt to society is paid through useful service, and the injured worker continues to contribute to the Forge world's productivity rather than becoming a burden on limited resources. Servitors handle the most hazardous work on Forge worlds. They enter reactor chambers flooded with lethal radiation to perform maintenance, their organic components absorbing doses that cause their flesh to necrotize and slew off while they continue working. They operate in the vacuum of orbital manufactorums without pressure suits, their lungs replaced with mechanical oxygen recyclers, and their skin treated with sealants that prevent explosive decompression. They wade through vats of industrial acid to clear blockages, their bodies dissolving slowly while their programming drives them to complete their assigned task. When a servitor fails, either through physical destruction or the breakdown of its mechanical components, it is simply replaced. The Forge worlds maintain vast stocks of criminals and injured workers awaiting conversion, and the servitor production facilities operate as efficiently as any other part of the manufacturing complex. The tech priests themselves undergo voluntary augmentation that transforms them into something increasingly distant from baseline humanity. The process begins with minor modifications, a mechadendrite tentacle that extends from the back to serve as an additional manipulator, an augmetic eye that can perceive electromagnetic spectra invisible to organic vision, or a respiratory system enhanced with filters and oxygen storage that allows survival in toxic atmospheres. As a tech priest rises through the ranks of the Mechanicus hierarchy, accumulating knowledge and proving their devotion to the machine god, they replace more of their organic components with superior mechanical alternatives. Senior magi might retain only their brain and perhaps a few other organs, the rest of their body consisting of advanced augmetics that grant capabilities far beyond human norms. This augmentation reflects Mechanicus theology, which holds that flesh is weak and imperfect while the machine is strong and pure. The goal, never explicitly stated but implicit in their practices, involves transcending the limitations of biological existence entirely. Some tech priests pursue this goal with such fervor that they become more machine than human, their thought processes altered by the computational systems integrated into their brains, their emotions suppressed by neural inhibitors, and their perception of reality filtered through sensor arrays that translate the physical world into streams of data. These individuals can interface directly with machine systems, their consciousness merging temporarily with the machine's spirits they serve, but they lose the capacity for human connection and emotional experience that defines baseline humanity. The political power of the Mechanicus within the Imperium stems from their absolute monopoly on technology and manufacturing. No other organization possesses the knowledge or facilities to produce the weapons, vehicles, and equipment that the Imperial military requires. The Space Marines depend on Mechanicus Forge worlds to manufacture their power armor, bolters, and vehicles. The Imperial Guard cannot function without the las guns, flak armor, and tanks that pour from Mechanicus production lines. Even the Imperial Navy requires Mechanicus shipyards to construct and maintain the massive void-going vessels that project Imperial power across the galaxy. This dependency gives the Mechanicus leverage that even the High Lords of Terra must respect. When the Mechanicus refuses to supply a particular war effort or delays shipments of critical equipment, entire campaigns can fail, and the Imperium's leadership has limited recourse. The Treaty of Mars, negotiated between the Emperor and the Mechanicus during the Great Crusade, formalized this relationship and granted the Mechanicus a degree of autonomy unique among Imperial institutions. Mars and its Forge worlds operate under Mechanicus law rather than Imperial law. Their tech priests answer to the Fabricator General rather than to the Administratum, and they maintain their own military forces independent of Imperial Guard command structures. The Skitarii, the cybernetic soldiers of the Mechanicus, serve as the primary military arm. These warriors undergo extensive augmentation that transforms them into living weapons optimized for specific combat roles. Skitarii Rangers carry advanced weaponry and enhanced sensory systems that allow them to engage enemies at extreme range. They're targeting cogitators, calculating ballistic solutions faster than any organic mind. Skitarii Vanguard troops wade into close combat with radium weapons that flood the battlefield with deadly radiation, their own bodies hardened against the effects through extensive modification. The Titan Legions represent the Mechanicus's ultimate expression of military power. These colossal war machines, some standing over 40 meters tall, embody the union of human will and machine power that the cult Mechanicus venerates. A Titan's crew, called Princeps and Moderati, interface directly with the machine systems through neural connections that blur the line between pilot and vehicle. The Princeps experiences the Titan's sensors as their own senses, feels the machine's weapons as extensions of their body, and must constantly battle the Titan's machine spirit for control. This machine spirit, whether a sophisticated AI system or something more esoteric, possesses a personality and will of its own, often reflecting the accumulated experiences of previous crews and the Titan's combat history. A Titan that has fought for millennia might develop a bloodthirsty nature that pushes its Princeps toward aggressive tactics, or a calculating intelligence that analyzes battlefield conditions and suggests strategies through impressions and impulses that the crew must interpret. The deployment of Titans to a battlefield represents a commitment of resources and prestige that the Mechanicus does not make lightly. Each Titan is irreplaceable, a relic from earlier ages that cannot be duplicated with current technology. When a Titan falls in battle, the Mechanicus goes to extraordinary lengths to recover it, dispatching entire armies to retrieve the wreckage and return it to Mars for restoration, or, if the damage is too severe, incorporation into new constructions. The loss of a Titan is mourned as the death of a revered ancestor, and the tech priests conduct elaborate funeral rites that can last for years. The Forge worlds compete among themselves for resources, prestige, and political influence within the Mechanicus hierarchy. Different Forge worlds specialize in different products and maintain different interpretations of Mechanicus doctrine, leading to theological disputes that can escalate into actual conflict. The Forge world of Ryza, famous for its plasma weapon production, might clash with Graia over the proper methods for blessing plasma coils, each claiming their techniques are more orthodox. These disputes rarely result in open warfare, but they manifest in economic competition, political maneuvering within the Mechanicus councils, and occasional sabotage or industrial espionage. The Fabricator General on Mars attempts to mediate these conflicts and maintain unity, but their authority has limits, and some Forge worlds operate with near-complete independence, acknowledging Martian supremacy in theory while ignoring it in practice. The Mechanicus maintains explorator fleets that venture beyond the Imperium's borders in search of lost technology and SDC fragments. These expeditions can last decades or centuries, with explorator ships jumping from system to system, scanning dead worlds and ancient space hulks for any sign of recoverable technology. The tech priests who crew these vessels are often the most radical members of the Mechanicus, individuals whose hunger for knowledge outweighs their concern for orthodox doctrine. They venture into regions of space where reality becomes unstable, board derelict ships that have spent millennia drifting through the warp, and excavate ruins on worlds where human civilization died out millennia ago. The artifacts they recover sometimes justify the enormous costs and risks, but many explorator fleets simply vanish, lost to warp storms, Xenos attacks, or the hazards of exploring technology they do not fully understand. The Inquisition operates beyond the authority structures that govern the rest of the Imperium, answerable only to the Emperor himself and wielding power that transcends planetary governments, sector commands, and even the High Lords of Terra. An Inquisitor carries a rosette, a symbol of their office that grants them absolute authority to commandeer military forces, requisition ships, access any Imperial facility, and execute anyone they deem a threat to humanity. This authority comes without oversight or accountability. No appeals process exists for those condemned by an inquisitor, no review board examines their decisions, and no superior authority questions their methods unless another inquisitor challenges them directly. The organization exists as humanity's ultimate defense against threats so dangerous that conventional imperial institutions cannot address them, and this necessity justifies methods that would be considered monstrous if employed by anyone else. The Inquisition divides itself into three major ordos, each focused on a specific category of threat. The Ordo Hereticus hunts witches, mutants, rogue psychers, and traitors within the Imperium's own population. The Ordo Xenos combats alien infiltration and the corrupting influence of Xenos artifacts and philosophy. The Ordo Malleus faces demonic incursions and the servants of chaos directly. These divisions are not absolute. Inquisitors frequently cross jurisdictional boundaries when investigations lead them into areas outside their primary expertise, and some inquisitors refuse to acknowledge the divisions at all, styling themselves simply as servants of the Emperor who will pursue any threat they encounter. The Ordo Hereticus emerged from the Age of Apostasy, a period of civil war and religious mania that nearly tore the Imperium apart in the 36th millennium. The ecclesiarchy had accumulated enormous power, and the Mad High Lord Goj Vander seized control of both the church and the administratum, ruling as a tyrant whose paranoia and cruelty killed billions. When his reign finally ended, the Inquisition established the Ordo Hereticus specifically to ensure that no institution within the Imperium could ever accumulate such unchecked power again. The irony that the Inquisition itself operates with precisely the kind of unchecked power it was created to prevent is not lost on the organization's critics, but such criticism is itself grounds for investigation as potential heresy. Witch hunters of the Ordo Hereticus operate throughout the Imperium, investigating reports of unsanctioned psychers, chaos cults, and corruption within imperial institutions. They work closely with the Adepta Sororitas, the Battle Sisters who serve as the military arm of the ecclesiarchy and frequently accompany inquisitors on their missions. A typical Hereticus investigation begins with rumors or reports that reach an inquisitor's network of informants. A planetary governor displaying unusual behavior, a spike in disappearances in a Hive city sector, or reports of strange phenomena that might indicate warp corruption. The Inquisitor arrives without warning, often in disguise, and begins gathering evidence through observation, interrogation, and infiltration of suspect organizations. The methods employed during these investigations acknowledge no limits based on conventional morality or law. Suspected cultists face interrogation techniques that include physical torture, chemical interrogation using drugs that break down mental resistance, and psychic probing by sanctioned psychers who tear through the subject's mind searching for hidden knowledge. The Inquisition justifies these methods through simple arithmetic. If torturing one suspect prevents a chaos cult from summoning a demon that would kill thousands, the torture is not merely acceptable, but morally required. A single heretic left alive might corrupt others, spreading taint that could eventually doom an entire world. Better to err on the side of excessive force than to show mercy that allows corruption to spread. When an inquisitor determines that a threat exists, their response scales according to their assessment of the danger. A small cult might be eliminated through a targeted strike using the inquisitor's personal retinue and local military forces. A larger organization requires mobilizing Imperial Guard regiments or calling upon Space Marine chapters to conduct a full military operation. The most severe threats trigger exterminatus protocols, the complete destruction of a world's biosphere to prevent corruption from spreading beyond containment. The decision to enact exterminatus rests solely with the Inquisitor, and they make this choice knowing they are condemning billions of innocent people to death along with the guilty. The calculus is brutal but consistent with imperial philosophy. A world that harbors significant chaos corruption cannot be cleansed through conventional means, and allowing even one corrupted individual to escape risks spreading the taint to other worlds. Exterminatus takes several forms depending on available resources and the nature of the threat. Cyclonic torpedoes, massive warheads that burrow deep into a planet's crust before detonating, trigger tectonic instability that tears the world apart from within. Atmospheric incinerators flood the atmosphere with combustible gas, then ignite it, creating a firestorm that scours all life from the surface. Virus bombs release modified life eater virus that consumes all organic matter within hours, reducing forests, cities, and populations to a slime that subsequently ignites due to the release of flammable gases from decaying biomass. Two-stage cyclonic torpedoes combine virus bombing with conventional warheads, ensuring complete sterilization. The Imperium has destroyed thousands of worlds through exterminatus over its 10,000-year history, and the Inquisition authorizes new deployments regularly, each time weighing billions of lives against the risk of allowing corruption to persist. The survivors of demonic incursions face execution even when they bear no taint themselves, because exposure to the creatures of the warp creates corruption vectors that cannot be reliably detected or eliminated. Imperial Guard regiments that fight alongside Grey Knights, the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Malleus, and the Imperium's most elite demon hunters, are typically executed after the campaign concludes. These soldiers fought bravely and won victories against impossible odds, but they witnessed things that no human should see: the true forms of demons, the reality of chaos, and the methods the Grey Knights employ to combat such threats. The Inquisition cannot risk these soldiers returning to their home worlds carrying memories that might inspire questions about the nature of reality, the limitations of the imperial truth, or the existence of powers beyond the Emperor's protection. The execution of these regiments, sometimes numbering in the millions, proceeds with cold efficiency. The soldiers are told they are being transported to a new deployment, loaded onto ships, and then killed en masse through decompression, poison gas, or simple mass execution by firing squad. The Ordo Xenos operates under the principle that alien species represent existential threats to humanity regardless of whether they demonstrate immediate hostile intent. The galaxy contains countless Xenos species, from the savage orcs to the technologically advanced Tau, from the ancient and mysterious Eldari to the soul-devouring Necrons. Each species pursues its own goals, and those goals inevitably conflict with human survival and imperial expansion. The Ordo Xenos studies these species, tracks their movements, and coordinates imperial responses to Xenos threats. They maintain vast archives of information about alien biology, technology, and culture, knowledge gathered through millennia of conflict and observation. Deathwatch, the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Xenos, consists of space marines seconded from their chapters to serve in mixed kill teams that hunt the most dangerous Xenos threats. These warriors bring expertise from dozens of different chapters, combining their varied combat doctrines and specializations to create highly flexible units capable of adapting to any alien threat. A Deathwatch kill team might include a Dark Angel's veteran skilled in hunting the fallen, an ultramarine tactical genius, a space wolf with centuries of experience fighting orcs, and a blood angel whose rage makes him devastating in close combat. These Marines paint their armor black and bear the Deathwatch insignia, temporarily setting aside their chapter identities to serve the Inquisition's broader mission. The Ordo Xenos faces constant temptation in the form of alien technology that surpasses Imperial capabilities in specific areas. Eldari weapons that fire monomolecular discs capable of slicing through ceramite armor, Tau pulse rifles with superior range and stopping power compared to Imperial lasguns, and Necron Gauss weapons that strip matter at the molecular level all represent tools that could enhance the Imperium's military effectiveness. The official doctrine of the Ordo Xenos holds that all Xenos artifacts are inherently corrupting and must be destroyed, but individual inquisitors frequently violate this doctrine, collecting and even using alien technology in their work. They justify these violations through the same logic that guides all inquisitorial operations. If using a Xenos weapon allows them to eliminate a greater threat, the corruption risk is acceptable. This reasoning leads down a dangerous path where inquisitors accumulate collections of alien artifacts, some of which carry their own dangers beyond simple technological function. Radical inquisitors push the boundaries of acceptable behavior even further, employing methods and tools that would see anyone else executed for heresy. Some bind demon hosts, trapping warp entities within human vessels and using these abominations as weapons against other threats. The process of creating a demon host requires a psyker of significant power, extensive warding to contain the demon once it manifests, and the willingness to damn a human soul to eternal torment as the demon and host consciousness battle for control. The resulting entity possesses power that can turn the tide of battle against otherwise unstoppable enemies, but it remains fundamentally unstable and dangerous. Demon hosts have turned on their supposed masters, broken free of their bindings, and caused catastrophic casualties before being destroyed or ray-bound. Other radical inquisitors study chaos itself, delving into forbidden texts and examining chaos artifacts to better understand the enemy they fight. They argue that ignorance serves no purpose when facing an enemy as insidious as the ruinous powers, that understanding the nature of chaos allows them to recognize its manifestations earlier and combat it more effectively. This study requires extraordinary mental discipline and spiritual fortitude, because the texts and artifacts they examine actively attempt to corrupt anyone who interacts with them. A book bound in human skin and inked in blood might contain genuinely useful information about chaos cult practices and demonic hierarchies, but reading it exposes the reader to corrupting influences that work subtly on their thoughts and perceptions. The Inquisitor must maintain absolute certainty in their purpose and their loyalty to the Emperor, because any doubt or weakness provides an opening for corruption to take root. The paradox at the heart of the Inquisition becomes apparent in these radical practices. The organization exists to hunt corruption in all its forms, yet inquisitors regularly employ the very tools and methods they condemn in others. They justify this through the doctrine of the incorruptible servant. An inquisitor, selected and trained specifically for their mental strength and loyalty, can wield corrupting tools without succumbing to corruption themselves because their purpose is pure and their will is absolute. This doctrine contains obvious flaws that manifest regularly when inquisitors fall to the very darkness they fight. An inquisitor who begins by studying chaos to better combat it might gradually come to believe they can harness chaos power for the Imperium's benefit. One who uses a demon host as a weapon might start to see demons as tools rather than enemies. The corruption works slowly, eroding judgment and twisting motivations until the inquisitor no longer recognizes their own fall. When an inquisitor does fall to corruption, the response comes from other inquisitors who investigate their colleague and, if necessary, hunt them down. These internal conflicts remain hidden from the broader Imperium because acknowledging that inquisitors can fall would undermine the authority of the entire organization. The battles between inquisitors can escalate to involve their full resources, retinues of warriors and specialists, requisitioned military forces, and even their respective chambers militant. A civil war between factions of the Inquisition might devastate entire sectors as both sides pursue their conception of the Emperor's will, each convinced that the other has strayed from the true path. The Ordo Malleus specializes in combating demonic incursions and maintains the closest relationship with the Grey Knights, the chapter of Space Marines created specifically to fight demons. The Grey Knights operate from Titan, Saturn's largest moon, which exists outside normal Imperial records and is protected by wards and secrecy protocols that keep its location hidden from all but the highest Imperial authorities. Every Grey Knight is a psyker, recruited from the most stable and powerful psykers the Black Ships collect, and their gene seed derives from the Emperor himself. Their training takes decades and incorporates psychic conditioning, exposure to warp phenomena under controlled conditions, and indoctrination in the names and natures of demons. A Grey Knight knows the true names of countless warp entities, knowledge that provides power over those entities, but also makes the Grey Knight a target for demonic attention. Grey Knights wear Aegis armor, ceramite blessed, and inscribed with protective wards that provide defense against both physical and psychic attacks. They carry Nemesis force weapons, psychically attuned blades that channel the wielder's mental power into devastating attacks that can permanently destroy demonic entities. A Grey Knight's bolter fires blessed ammunition, each round inscribed with prayers and anointed with holy oils. When Grey Knights deploy to combat a demonic incursion, They arrive in silver thunderhawks, chanting litanies that create a zone of psychic stability around them, pushing back the reality-warping effects that demons bring with their presence. The Ordo Malleus maintains fortress monasteries on worlds throughout the Imperium, hidden facilities, where inquisitors store their most dangerous artifacts and conduct research into the nature of chaos. These facilities exist in remote locations, often on dead worlds or in asteroid bases far from inhabited systems, because the materials stored within them represent catastrophic threats if they were ever to be released or stolen. A single Ordo Malleus vault might contain demon weapons seized from Chaos champions, books written by heretics detailing summoning rituals, and physical samples of warp-touched materials that defy conventional physics. The Inquisitors who staff these facilities undergo regular psychic screening to detect any signs of corruption, and entire fortress monasteries have been destroyed when the corruption proved too deep to eliminate surgically. Life under inquisitorial investigation transforms entire populations into suspects, creating atmospheres of paranoia and fear that can be as damaging as actual corruption. When an inquisitor arrives on a world to investigate potential heresy, they often begin by restricting travel and communications, isolating the investigation site from the broader Imperium. Citizens find themselves subject to arbitrary detention and interrogation, their homes searched without warning, and their associates questioned about their beliefs and activities. The Inquisitor's agents move through the population in disguise, listening to conversations in taverns and markets, watching for any sign of heretical belief or practice. A careless word spoken in anger, a joke that questions imperial authority, or simply association with someone later identified as a cultist can result in arrest and interrogation. The terror of arbitrary persecution serves the Inquisition's purposes by encouraging citizens to police themselves and report suspicious behavior in others. Neighbors inform on neighbors, workers report their supervisors, and children are taught to alert authorities if their parents express doubts about the imperial creed. This culture of suspicion prevents organized resistance from forming and makes it difficult for actual cults to operate, but it also destroys social cohesion and trust. Communities that have experienced inquisitorial investigations often emerge fractured and traumatized, their populations viewing each other with suspicion and fear that persists for generations. The Inquisition's doctrine holds that 1 billion innocent deaths are acceptable to eliminate one heretic, a calculus that reflects the existential nature of the threats they combat. A single heretic who escapes justice might establish a cult that grows over decades until it numbers in the millions. A demon that manifests unchecked can slaughter entire hive cities before it is banished. A gene stealer that goes undetected spawns a cult that will eventually call down a tyrannid hive fleet to consume the planet. Measured against these potential catastrophes, the death of innocents caught in the Inquisition's purges represents acceptable collateral damage. The Inquisition does not apologize for these deaths or attempt to minimize them through more careful investigation. Speed and certainty matter more than precision when dealing with threats that can spread exponentially if given time to establish themselves. The Inquisition maintains networks of informants, agents, and specialists across the Imperium. These individuals might be Imperial Guard officers who report unusual activity among their troops, administratum clerks who flag suspicious patterns in tithe records, or underworld criminals who trade information for clemency. An Inquisitor's retinue typically includes specialists recruited for specific skills: psychers who can detect warp taint, tech priests who can analyze alien artifacts, warriors trained in multiple combat styles, and savants with encyclopedic knowledge of specific subjects. These retinue members serve at the Inquisitor's pleasure and can be dismissed or executed if they fail in their duties or show signs of corruption. Many serve for decades, becoming trusted companions who share their Inquisitor's missions and secrets, but they remain subordinates whose lives belong to their master. The requisition authority that Inquisitors wield allows them to commandeer virtually any Imperial resource for their investigations. An Inquisitor can order a planetary governor to provide troops, requisition ships from the Imperial Navy, or demand that a Space Marine chapter deploy forces to support their mission. These requests are not truly requests, refusal to comply with an inquisitor's demands constitutes obstruction of their duties and can result in charges of heresy. This power creates resentment among imperial authorities who find their carefully laid plans disrupted by inquisitorial intervention, but no one dares refuse openly. The inquisitor who arrives demanding transport, troops, and supplies might be investigating the very authorities they make demands upon, and any resistance could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. The mutation that grants psychic ability manifests in approximately 1 human per million births across the Imperium, though the rate varies significantly between worlds and populations. This mutation represents one of humanity's most dangerous evolutionary developments, a quirk of genetics that allows certain individuals to perceive and manipulate the warp directly. The warp, that roiling dimension of raw emotion and psychic energy that underlies real space, responds to the presence of psychers like predators detecting wounded prey. A human mind capable of touching the warp shines like a beacon in that terrible realm, drawing the attention of entities that hunger for the opportunity to enter the material universe. Every untrained psyker represents a potential gateway through which demons might pour into reality, and the Imperium's history contains countless examples of worlds destroyed because a single psyker lost control at the wrong moment. The manifestation of psychic powers follows no predictable pattern. Some children display abilities from birth, moving objects with their thoughts or hearing voices that others cannot perceive. Others remain dormant until adolescence, when hormonal changes and emotional stress trigger latent abilities that explode outward with devastating consequences. A teenage psyker experiencing their first manifestation might accidentally set fire to their family's HAB unit through pyrokinetic discharge, or cause everyone within 100 meters to experience their emotional state as their own, or simply tear a hole in reality that allows warp entities to manifest. The survivors of such incidents, if any exist, typically report a period of strange occurrences preceding the catastrophic event. Objects moving on their own, unexplained sounds, a feeling of being watched by something that exists just beyond normal perception. The Imperial authorities maintain extensive surveillance networks designed to identify psychers before their abilities manifest catastrophically. Planetary governors are required to report any signs of psychic activity to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the organization responsible for collecting and processing psychers throughout the Imperium. Local enforcers receive training in recognizing the signs, unexplained phenomena, reports of telepathic contact, physical manifestations like spontaneous combustion or localized temperature changes. The ecclesiarchy's priests watch for children who seem to know things they should not, or who speak of visions and voices that might indicate psychic sensitivity. Families who attempt to hide psychic children face execution alongside the psyker, because concealing such a threat endangers the entire planetary population. The black ships arrive without warning, massive vessels painted in black and marked with the symbol of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. These ships maintain irregular schedules, jumping from system to system according to routes determined by the Telepathica's needs and the density of psyker populations in different regions. A world might see a black ship once every few decades, or multiple ships might arrive within years of each other if the psyker population has grown beyond normal parameters. The ships enter orbit and broadcast their presence, and planetary authorities begin the process of gathering the psychers identified since the last collection. Arbites enforcers and local military units conduct sweeps through hive cities, agri-world settlements, and noble estates, rounding up anyone flagged as a potential psyker. The collected psychers range from infants barely able to walk to elderly individuals whose powers remain dormant or weak enough to avoid detection for decades. They are brought to designated collection points, typically starports or landing fields where the black ship's shuttles can access them easily. The psychers arrive in chains or restraints because even weak psychers can be dangerous when terrified, and terror is the universal response to being seized by Imperial authorities and told you are being taken off-world. Families who accompany their children to the collection points are turned away at gunpoint. The telepathica allows no contact between psychers and their former lives once collection begins. A mother watching her child being loaded onto a shuttle has no way of knowing whether that child will be trained as an astropath, fed to the Emperor, or processed into some other resource the Imperium requires. The conditions aboard the black ships reflect the Imperium's view of psychers as dangerous cargo, rather than human beings deserving of dignity or comfort. The psychers are confined in holding cells deep within the ship's hull, spaces barely large enough for the occupants to lie down, with minimal lighting and no amenities beyond waste reclamation drains. The cells are lined with psychically reactive materials that suppress the inmates' abilities, preventing them from using their powers to escape or communicate. These suppressors cause constant discomfort, a feeling of pressure inside the skull, and a dull ache that pervades the entire body. The psychers can hear each other through the thin walls, their fear and despair creating a psychic miasma that even the suppressors cannot entirely contain. The journey to Terra can take months or years depending on the ship's route and the number of collection stops it must make. The black ships travel with their holds full, gathering psychers from dozens of worlds before making the journey to the Sol system. During this time, the psychers receive minimal food and water, just enough to keep them alive. The crew, members of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, who have undergone conditioning to resist the psychic pressure of transporting thousands of psychers simultaneously, monitor the holds for signs of manifestation or possession. When a psycher loses control, either through fear, desperation, or simple inability to contain their power under the stress of confinement, the response is immediate and brutal. Armed guards in psychically shielded armor enter the affected section and execute everyone in the vicinity, because determining which specific psycher caused the disturbance matters less than ensuring it does not spread. The mortality rate during transport runs between 10 and 20% on a typical voyage, higher if the ship encounters warp storms or other complications. Bodies are processed through the ship's rendering facilities, their organic components recycled according to standard Imperial efficiency protocols. The survivors arrive at Terra in various states of physical and mental deterioration. Months of confinement in darkness, inadequate nutrition, and constant psychic pressure leave them emaciated, their skin pale from lack of sunlight, their minds damaged by trauma and sensory deprivation. They are unloaded at facilities in the Himalaysian mountains, processed through intake centers where telepathica officials conduct preliminary assessments of their psychic strength and stability. The testing process sorts psychers into categories that determine their ultimate fate. The strongest and most stable, those who display significant psychic power combined with the mental discipline to control it, are selected for training as sanctioned psychers. These individuals, perhaps 1 in 100 of those who arrive on Terra, will undergo the soul-binding ritual that connects them permanently to the Emperor's psychic presence. The moderately powerful but less stable might be assigned to less demanding roles or held in reserve for future needs. The weak, the unstable, and those whose powers manifest in ways the telepathica deems unsuitable for training face a different destiny. They are marked for the Golden Throne, to be consumed in the daily feeding that keeps the Emperor alive and the astronomic in burning. The tithe of the Golden Throne operates with mechanical precision, a ritual that has continued without interruption for 10,000 years. Every day, approximately 1,000 psychers are brought before the Golden Throne in a procession that winds through the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace. The Adeptus Custodes oversee this ritual, their golden armor gleaming in the dim light as they ensure the process proceeds according to ancient protocols. The psychers, most barely conscious from sedatives administered to prevent panic or resistance, are led or carried to the chamber where the Golden Throne dominates the space. The device itself defies easy description, a fusion of technology and arcane machinery that extends through multiple levels of the palace, its systems maintained by tech priests who treat it as the holiest of all machines. The Emperor sits entombed within the throne, his physical form reduced to little more than a skeleton after 10 millennia of existence in this half-dead state. Yet his psychic presence fills the chamber with such intensity that even non-psychers can feel it as pressure against their minds. The Psychers being fed to the throne experience this presence as an overwhelming force that strips away their individual consciousness and consumes their souls. There is no dignity in this death, no glory or recognition. The Psychers simply cease to exist as individuals, their life force drawn into the Emperor to sustain his own psychic power for another day. Their bodies, drained of the spark that animated them, collapse and are removed by servitors who process them through the palace's rendering facilities. The scale of this sacrifice staggers comprehension when examined over the span of imperial history. 1,000 Psychers per day amounts to roughly 365,000 per year. Over 10,000 years, the Emperor has consumed approximately 3.65 billion human souls, each one a person with their own thoughts, fears, and dreams, reduced to fuel for the Astronomicon. The Imperium considers this an acceptable price for survival. Without the Astronomicon, warp travel becomes impossible across the vast distances that separate imperial worlds, and the Imperium would fragment into isolated systems unable to support each other or coordinate defense against external threats. The Psychers die so that humanity as a species can continue to exist, their individual lives meaningless in the calculus of species survival. Those Psychers selected for training as sanctioned Psychers face a different but equally terrible fate. The training facilities maintained by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica on Terra and other Fortress worlds subject Psychers to years of conditioning designed to strengthen their mental defenses and teach them to control their abilities without succumbing to possession. The training combines psychic exercises, physical conditioning, and extensive indoctrination in imperial doctrine. Trainees learn to construct mental barriers that protect their consciousness from warp predators, to channel their powers through specific techniques that minimize the risk of losing control, and to recognize the signs of demonic influence in themselves and others. The failure rate during training exceeds 50%. Those who fail either die during the training itself, their minds destroyed by the psychic exercises, or are deemed too unstable for sanctioning and redirected to the Golden Throne. The soul-binding ritual that transforms a trained Psycher into a sanctioned Psycher involves direct exposure to the Emperor's psychic presence. The Psycher is brought before the Golden Throne, not to be consumed, but to be marked permanently by contact with the Emperor's consciousness. The experience of soul binding varies between individuals, but certain elements remain consistent across all accounts. The Psycher perceives the Emperor as an overwhelming presence of pure psychic power, a consciousness so vast and ancient that individual human minds cannot fully comprehend it. The contact sears itself into the Psycher's soul, creating a permanent connection that can never be severed. This connection provides protection against demonic possession, because entities attempting to enter the Psycher's mind encounter the Emperor's mark and recoil from it, but it also inflicts constant agony. The physical effects of soul binding manifest immediately and dramatically. The Psycher's eyes burn out from the intensity of the psychic contact, leaving empty sockets or ruined tissue that weeps constantly. Some soul-bound Psychers retain limited vision through their psychic senses, perceiving the world as patterns of energy and emotion rather than physical forms. Others remain completely blind, dependent on attendants or servo skulls to navigate physical spaces. The pain of the soul binding never fully fades. Sanctioned Psychers describe it as a constant burning sensation in their minds, a pressure that makes concentration difficult and sleep nearly impossible. Many develop dependencies on obscura or other drugs that dull the pain enough to function, though the Telepathica discourages such dependencies as signs of weakness. Astropaths represent the largest category of sanctioned Psychers, their abilities focused on telepathic communication across interstellar distances. These individuals form the Imperium's primary means of faster-than-light communication, transmitting messages through the warp to other astropaths stationed on distant worlds. The process of astropathic transmission requires the sender to project their consciousness into the warp, encode their message in psychic imagery and symbolism that can survive the journey through that hostile realm, and direct it toward the intended recipient. The Astronomicon serves as a reference point, allowing astropaths to orient themselves in the warp and aim their transmissions with some degree of accuracy. Even with this aid, astropathic messages frequently arrive garbled or incomplete, their content distorted by the chaotic nature of the warp or interference from warp entities that intercept and corrupt the transmissions. Receiving astropathic messages involves similar risks. The recipient must open their mind to the warp, making themselves vulnerable to anything that might be riding along with the legitimate message. Demonic entities sometimes disguise themselves as astropathic communications, attempting to gain access to the recipient's mind through this vector. Astropaths undergo extensive training in recognizing such intrusions, but the deceptions can be sophisticated and mistakes prove fatal. An astropath who accepts a corrupted message might find their consciousness invaded by a demonic presence that uses their body as a gateway to manifest in real space. The other astropaths stationed at the same facility maintain constant vigilance for signs of possession among their colleagues, and sanctioned executions of compromised astropaths occur regularly enough that the Telepathica considers them routine operational losses. The physical toll of regular astropathic work accumulates over time. Each transmission or reception requires the astropath to expose their consciousness to the warp, and this exposure causes incremental damage to their psyche and physical form. Veteran astropaths often display signs of premature aging, their hair turning white and their skin developing a translucent quality. Some develop stigmata, spontaneous wounds that bleed without physical cause, or other manifestations that reflect the psychic stress they endure. The average operational lifespan of an astropath rarely exceeds 20 years from their initial assignment, though some exceptional individuals serve for decades before the accumulated damage renders them unable to continue. Battle Psychers serve a more direct combat role, their abilities weaponized for deployment alongside Imperial Guard regiments or Space Marine forces. These Psychers learn to channel the warp's energy into destructive manifestations, bolts of lightning that arc between enemies, walls of flame that consume entire squads, or telekinetic forces that crush vehicles and fortifications. The power available to a skilled battle psyker can turn the tide of engagements that conventional weapons cannot resolve, but the risks scale proportionally with the power employed. Each time a battle psyker draws deeply on the warp, they risk losing control and becoming a conduit for demonic manifestation. The more power they channel, the brighter they shine in the warp, and the more attractive they become as targets for predatory entities seeking entry into real space. Battle Psychers assigned to Imperial Guard regiments operate under the supervision of commissars, who carry specific orders regarding their management. These orders acknowledge that Psychers represent both valuable assets and potential catastrophic threats. The commissar monitors the Psycher for signs of possession or corruption, and maintains readiness to execute them immediately if such signs appear. The Psyker understands this arrangement explicitly. They know that the commissar walking behind them will put a bolt round through their skull at the first indication that they have become compromised. This knowledge creates additional stress that makes control more difficult, but the Imperium considers it a necessary precaution. A possessed Psyker who manifests a demon in the middle of an Imperial Guard formation can kill hundreds or thousands of soldiers before being stopped, and preventing such incidents justifies the psychological burden placed on sanctioned Psychers. The relationship between battle Psychers and the regular soldiers they serve alongside reflects the broader Imperial attitude toward Psychers. The soldiers understand intellectually that sanctioned Psychers are necessary, and that they have been tested and marked by the Emperor himself, but this understanding does not overcome the instinctive revulsion and fear that Psychers inspire. The soldiers see their battle Psycher comrades perform feats that defy natural law, channeling powers that should not exist, and they cannot help but view them as fundamentally wrong. The Psychers eat separately, sleep in isolated quarters, and are excluded from the informal social bonds that form between regular soldiers. They exist as tools to be used rather than comrades to be trusted, and most accept this isolation as simply another aspect of their cursed existence. Sanctioned Psychers assigned to inquisitorial retinues or as advisors to planetary governors occupy slightly higher social positions, but endure similar isolation and suspicion. These individuals provide services that non-Psychers cannot, detecting warp taint, reading surface thoughts to identify lies or hidden knowledge, and providing psychic defense against enemy psykers. Their abilities make them valuable enough that their employers tolerate their presence despite the inherent danger and discomfort. An inquisitor might rely heavily on their psyker advisors during investigations, using their abilities to extract information from suspects or to sense the presence of demonic corruption, but this reliance does not translate into trust or affection. The inquisitor maintains constant vigilance for signs that their psykers have become compromised, and several members of a typical inquisitorial retinue exist specifically to kill the psykers if necessary. The constant psychic agony that sanctioned psykers endure, combined with their social isolation and the knowledge that they are viewed as dangerous aberrations by the society they serve, creates psychological damage that accumulates alongside the physical deterioration caused by their powers. Many sanctioned psykers develop severe mental health issues, depression, anxiety, paranoia, and various forms of psychosis that manifest as their minds struggle to process the chronic stress of their existence. The Telepathica provides no mental health support beyond basic conditioning designed to maintain operational effectiveness. A psyker who becomes too psychologically damaged to perform their assigned duties faces retirement, which typically means reassignment to less demanding roles until they deteriorate to the point where they can no longer function, at which point they are either granted the Emperor's peace through execution, or, in some cases, fed to the Golden Throne like the unsanctioned psykers they might have become if not for their training. The Imperium's treatment of psykers reflects its fundamental pragmatism regarding human life and suffering. Psykers are simultaneously essential and dangerous, valuable resources that must be exploited and existential threats that must be controlled. The system that collects them in childhood, transports them in horrific conditions, sorts them with brutal efficiency, and either consumes them or transforms them into tortured servants operates exactly as designed. It provides the Imperium with the astropaths needed for communication, the battle psykers needed for warfare, and the daily sacrifice needed to keep the Emperor alive. The individual suffering of millions of psykers matters not at all in this calculation. They are born cursed, their mutation marking them as different from baseline humanity, and the Imperium uses them until they are used up, then discards them and collects more. The black ships will arrive again, the holds will fill with terrified psykers torn from their families, and the feeding of the Golden Throne will continue for another day, another year, another millennium, for as long as the Imperium endures. The Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds, but the distances between them render conventional space travel useless for maintaining any form of cohesive civilization. Light itself takes years or decades to cross the voids between stars, and no ship traveling at sublight speeds could complete a journey between systems within a human lifetime. The warp provides the only solution to this fundamental problem of distance, allowing ships to enter that parallel dimension where the normal laws of physics break down and the concept of distance becomes malleable. A journey that would take centuries through real space can be completed in days or weeks through the warp, but this convenience comes with a cost measured in sanity, lives, and the constant risk of damnation. The warp exists as a reflection of the material universe, a dimension composed of psychic energy and raw emotion rather than matter and conventional physics. Every sentient thought, every feeling of rage or joy or despair, creates ripples in the warp. The collective consciousness of humanity and other species generates currents and tides in that realm, and these currents can be navigated by those with the ability to perceive them. The problem lies in what else inhabits the warp. Demons, entities formed from concentrated emotion and given terrible purpose by the chaos gods, swim through that realm like predators in an ocean. They perceive ships entering the warp as bright points of light, concentrations of mortal souls ripe for consumption or corruption. A ship without proper protection would be torn apart within moments of translation, its crew possessed or destroyed before they could even comprehend what was happening to them. The Geller field represents humanity's primary defense against the horrors of warp travel. This technology, one of the few reliable pieces of Dark Age equipment that the Mechanicus can still manufacture consistently, projects a bubble of real space physics around a ship. Inside the Geller field, the normal laws of reality continue to function. Gravity works as expected, time flows consistently, and the crew remains protected from direct exposure to the warp's reality-distorting effects. The field creates a barrier that demons cannot easily penetrate, though they press against it constantly during warp transit, seeking any weakness or fluctuation that might allow them entry. The generators that produce Geller fields require constant maintenance and consume enormous amounts of power. Tech priests assigned to warp-capable vessels spend much of their time monitoring field integrity, performing the proper rituals of maintenance, and replacing components that degrade under the stress of repeated warp exposure. Geller field failures occur with disturbing regularity despite all precautions. A power fluctuation, a manufacturing defect in a critical component, or simple age-related degradation can cause the field to collapse or develop gaps. When this happens during warp transit, the results are invariably catastrophic. The crew suddenly finds themselves exposed to the raw warp, their minds unable to process the impossible geometries and the presence of entities that should not exist. Some go mad immediately, their sanity shattered by direct perception of chaos. Others become possessed as demons pour through the gaps in reality, using the crew's bodies as vessels to manifest in the physical space of the ship. The possessed turn on their former comrades with inhuman strength and abilities that defy explanation, killing with clawed hands that were human moments before or speaking words that cause listeners' heads to explode from psychic pressure. Ships that experience Geller field failure rarely survive to reach their destination. The crew either kills each other in the resulting chaos, the ship becomes so corrupted that it transforms into something no longer recognizably human in origin, or the vessel simply disappears into the warp, lost forever to the Imperium's records. Occasionally, a ship emerges from warp transit showing signs of field failure, but with some crew still alive. These survivors are immediately quarantined and subjected to extensive examination by the Inquisition. Most are executed regardless of whether they show obvious signs of corruption, because exposure to the warp without Geller field protection creates taint that may not manifest for years or decades. The ship itself is typically scuttled or subjected to extensive purification rituals before being returned to service, and even then, many captains refuse to serve aboard vessels with histories of field failure, believing them cursed or fundamentally compromised. The actual process of warp travel requires a navigator, a human mutant whose genetic aberration allows them to perceive the warp directly without going insane. The navigator houses maintain a monopoly on this ability, their bloodlines carefully managed through thousands of years of selective breeding and genetic manipulation. Every navigator possesses a third eye, typically located in the center of their forehead and kept covered when not in use. This warp eye allows them to see the currents and eddies of the Imperium, to distinguish the relatively stable paths through that chaos, and most critically, to perceive the Astronomicon. That great psychic lighthouse burning from Terra provides the fixed reference point that makes long-distance warp navigation possible. Without it, navigators would be lost in the constantly shifting madness of the warp, unable to determine direction or plot courses between stars. The navigator houses operate as powerful political entities within the Imperium, their importance derived from the simple fact that interstellar civilization cannot function without them. No amount of technology or psychic power can replace what a navigator provides. The Adeptus Mechanicus has attempted for millennia to develop alternative navigation systems, but every attempt has failed or produced results so unreliable as to be useless. The navigator houses leverage this irreplaceability ruthlessly, negotiating contracts with ship captains, rogue traders, and imperial authorities that ensure their continued wealth and influence. A single navigator can demand enormous fees for their services, and they do so knowing that ship captains have no choice but to pay. Without a navigator, a ship cannot safely travel beyond its local system, and the Imperium's vast military and commercial operations would grind to a halt. The physical and mental toll of navigation accumulates with each journey. A navigator must open their warp eye and expose their consciousness to the Imperium's madness to plot courses and guide ships through warp transit. They perceive things that would destroy an unprotected human mind, the writhing forms of demons pressing against the Geller field, the impossible colors and geometries of warp space, and the psychic screams of souls being consumed by the entities that hunt in that realm. Navigators develop various coping mechanisms and mental disciplines to process these experiences without going insane, but the exposure leaves marks. Veteran navigators often display physical mutations beyond their third eye, extra fingers, skin that shifts color based on their emotional state, or an aura of wrongness that makes normal humans uncomfortable in their presence. The navigator houses face a crisis that threatens their long-term survival. The genetic manipulation and inbreeding necessary to maintain the navigator mutation has led to increasing instability in their bloodlines. Each generation produces fewer stable navigators and more individuals whose mutations render them useless or dangerous. Some are born with their warp eye unable to close, leaving them perpetually exposed to psychic stimuli that drives them mad within years. Others develop mutations so extreme that they cannot function in human society, their bodies twisted into forms that bear little resemblance to baseline humanity. The houses attempt to manage this genetic degradation through careful breeding programs and by seeking out new bloodlines to introduce genetic diversity, but the problem worsens with each passing century. Some among the navigator houses whisper that their mutation is dying out, that within a few thousand years, there may not be enough functional navigators to maintain the Imperium's current level of interstellar activity. The experience of warp travel for those not directly involved in navigation varies dramatically depending on the ship, the length of the journey, and the stability of the warp in the regions being traversed. On well-maintained vessels with experienced crews, a routine journey might pass with minimal incident. The crew goes about their duties, maintaining the ship systems and standing watches as they would during real space travel. The main difference lies in the psychological pressure that builds during warp transit. Even with functioning Geller fields, the crew can sense something of the warp's presence. They experience vivid nightmares, hear sounds that have no physical source, and feel watched by presences they cannot see. These effects intensify the longer a journey continues, and extended warp transits can leave crews psychologically damaged even when nothing overtly catastrophic occurs. Time flows inconsistently within the warp, one of its most disorienting and dangerous properties. A ship might enter warp transit expecting a journey of 2 weeks and emerge after 3 days of subjective time, or spend what feels like months in the warp, only to discover that mere hours have passed in real space. The discrepancy works in both directions and follows no predictable pattern. Ships have emerged from warp transit to find themselves arriving centuries after their departure, their crews having experienced only a normal journey duration, while the Imperium they left behind has changed beyond recognition. Others arrive before they departed according to real space chronology, creating paradoxes that tech priests and inquisitors debate endlessly without reaching satisfactory explanations. The crews of such vessels often find themselves out of phase with the reality they return to, their memories and experiences not matching the timeline of events in real space. Warp storms represent the most severe disruption to Imperium-wide travel and communication. These massive disturbances in the Immaterium can span entire sectors, making warp travel through affected regions impossible or suicidally dangerous. The causes of warp storms vary. Major events in real space, particularly those involving massive loss of life or intense emotional trauma, create corresponding disturbances in the warp. The birth of a new chaos god or the manifestation of a greater demon can trigger storms that persist for centuries. Some warp storms appear without obvious cause, spontaneous formations in the Immaterium that expand and contract according to patterns no human can predict or understand. The Great Rift that tore across the galaxy following the fall of Cadia represents the most catastrophic warp storm in recent Imperial history, splitting the Imperium in half and cutting off entire sectors from Terra for extended periods. When a warp storm cuts off a region of space, the worlds within that region face isolation that can last for generations. Without warp travel, they cannot receive supplies, reinforcements, or communication from the broader Imperium. Astropathic messages cannot penetrate the storm's interference. The worlds must survive on their own resources, fighting whatever threats they face without hope of Imperial aid. Some regions emerge from isolation relatively intact, their populations having weathered the storm through careful resource management and strong local leadership. Others fall to Xeno's invasion, chaos, corruption, or simple societal collapse during the isolation. When the storm finally clears and Imperial forces re-establish contact, they often find worlds that have regressed technologically, developed heretical beliefs in the absence of ecclesiarchy guidance, or been completely depopulated by disasters that no one survived to report. The fragmentation of the Imperium into isolated sectors fighting their own wars without coordination or support from Terra represents the practical reality of governing a million worlds spread across the galaxy. Even without warp storms, the sheer distances involved mean that many Imperial worlds operate with functional independence for decades or centuries between contacts with higher authorities. A world might pay its tithes when the collection ships arrive, send its psychers when the black ships come, and otherwise govern itself according to local interpretations of Imperial law. The planetary governor makes decisions knowing that any request for guidance or support from Sector Command will take months or years to receive a response, and by then the situation will have changed completely. This isolation creates enormous variation in how Imperial law and culture manifest on different worlds. Two planets in the same sector might interpret the Imperial creed in completely different ways, develop incompatible legal systems, and view each other as barely recognizable as fellow Imperial citizens despite both claiming loyalty to the Emperor. When Imperial authorities attempt to enforce standardization or investigate deviations from orthodoxy, they often encounter resistance from populations who have been operating under their local interpretations for so long that they view the correct Imperial practices as foreign impositions. The Imperium tolerates this variation out of necessity, intervening only when deviation becomes severe enough to constitute actual heresy or threatens the collection of tithes. Communication through astropathic choirs provides the only means of faster-than-light messaging across interstellar distances, but the system suffers from severe limitations that cripple effective coordination. A message sent from one side of a sector to another must pass through multiple relay stations, each staffed by astropaths who receive the message, interpret it, and retransmit it toward the next station. Each transmission introduces potential for error or corruption. The symbolic and emotional encoding that astropathic messages use to survive warp transit makes them inherently ambiguous, requiring interpretation by the receiving astropath. A message about enemy fleet movements might arrive as visions of burning ships and screaming souls, which the receiving astropath must decode into actionable intelligence. Different astropaths might interpret the same psychic imagery differently, leading to messages that change meaning as they pass through the relay chain. The time required for astropathic communication scales with distance and the current state of the warp. A message traveling between neighboring systems might arrive within days if conditions are favorable. Communication across a sector typically takes weeks or months. Messages sent from one side of the Imperium to the other can take years to arrive, if they arrive at all. Many messages are simply lost, intercepted by warp entities, or so corrupted during transit that they become unintelligible. The Administratum maintains vast bureaucracies dedicated to tracking message traffic, comparing multiple transmissions of the same information to identify errors, and attempting to maintain coherent records of communications across the Imperium. Despite these efforts, the system functions poorly, with critical information frequently arriving too late to be useful or not arriving at all. Military operations across multiple sectors become exercises in frustration due to these communication limitations. A Lord General commanding a crusade might dispatch requests for reinforcements to neighboring sectors, then wait months for responses while their forces are ground down by enemy action. By the time reinforcements arrive, the strategic situation may have changed so dramatically that the additional troops are no longer needed in their original deployment location, but redirecting them requires another round of communications and delays. Commanders learn to operate with the assumption that they will receive no timely support or guidance from higher authority, making plans based on the resources immediately available, and accepting that they may be fighting battles that strategic command considers irrelevant or counterproductive. The isolation between worlds creates situations where entire campaigns are fought and concluded before Terra learns they have begun. A sector might face a major orc invasion, fight a desperate war lasting decades, and finally achieve victory or suffer complete defeat, all while Terra remains ignorant of the crisis. The reports eventually reach the administratum, years or decades after the fact, and are filed away in archives where they join billions of other historical records. The soldiers who fought and died in those campaigns receive no recognition from the broader Imperium, their sacrifices known only to the local populations they defended. This anonymity extends to entire regiments and fleets that disappear into the vastness of the galaxy, fighting wars that no one beyond their immediate area of operations will ever know occurred. Ships lost in the warp represent one of the Imperium's most persistent sources of attrition. Vessels enter warp transit and simply never emerge at their destinations. Some are destroyed during transit, torn apart by demonic attack or Geller field failure. Others become trapped in warp currents that carry them far off course, emerging in completely different regions of the galaxy centuries after their departure. These lost ships sometimes return as space hulks, their crews long dead and their hulls corrupted by extended warp exposure, drifting through real space as hazards to navigation and potential sources of archaeotech for salvage teams brave or foolish enough to board them. The Administratum maintains records of lost ships, but the sheer number makes individual tracking impossible. Entire fleets have disappeared without trace, their fates unknown and unknowable, their loss discovered only when they fail to arrive at their assigned destinations, and no wreckage is ever found. The psychological impact of warp travel on those who experience it regularly cannot be overstated. Ship crews develop superstitions and rituals designed to ward off bad luck or appease whatever entities might be watching from beyond the Geller field. They refuse to speak certain words during warp transit, believing that naming demons might draw their attention. They perform elaborate pre-transit ceremonies, checking and rechecking systems that have already been verified as functional because the ritual of checking provides psychological comfort. Veterans of multiple warp journeys often display signs of long-term psychological damage, paranoia, insomnia, and a haunted quality that never quite fades. They have seen too much, felt too much of the warp's presence pressing against the thin barrier of the Geller field, and the knowledge of what waits in that other realm colors every moment of their existence. The nightmare of the Immaterium pervades every aspect of the Imperium's existence, an unavoidable reality that must be accepted to maintain any form of interstellar civilization. Every ship that enters the warp risks destruction. Every message sent through astropathic relay might be lost or corrupted. Every world exists in isolation, punctuated by irregular contact with the broader Imperium. This fragmentation and unreliability means that the Imperium functions less as a unified empire and more as a loose confederation of isolated regions that share common symbols and nominal loyalty to Terra, but operate largely independently. The Emperor's light reaches across the galaxy through the Astronomicon, but the darkness between the stars remains vast and filled with horrors that make every journey a gamble, with stakes measured in human lives and souls. The Imperium faces extinction from 1,000 different directions simultaneously, but perhaps no threat generates more existential dread among those who understand the strategic situation than the Tyranids. These extragalactic horrors arrived from beyond the galaxy's eastern fringe, their hive fleets detected first as astronomical anomalies, entire star systems going dark as something consumed every trace of organic matter within them. The Tyranids do not conquer or occupy territory in any conventional sense. They consume. Every living thing on a world targeted by a hive fleet becomes raw material for the swarm, broken down at the molecular level, and absorbed into the vast biological collective that spans light years of space. The first major contact with Tyranids occurred when hive fleet behemoths struck the eastern fringe, its vanguard organisms falling upon worlds that had no context for understanding what attacked them. Planetary defense forces trained to fight orcs or repel chaos cultists found themselves facing a completely alien threat that operated with perfect coordination and adapted to their tactics within days. The organisms that make up a Tyranid swarm range from the size of attack dogs to living biotitans that dwarf Imperial knights. Hormagaunts sprint on four legs toward enemy positions faster than most humans can run, their scything talons capable of disemboweling armored soldiers with single strikes. Termagants follow in their wake, living weapons bonded to their bodies firing beetles, maggots, or crystalline shards propelled by muscle contractions rather than chemical propellants. The larger organisms demonstrate the true horror of Tyranid bioengineering. Carnifexes, monstrous creatures standing twice the height of a man and massing several tons, charge through defensive lines like living battering rams, their armored carapaces shrugging off lasgun fire that would kill dozens of lesser organisms. Tyranid warriors coordinate the swarm's actions through synaptic links to the hive mind, the vast collective intelligence that controls every organism in the fleet. These warriors carry weapons that fire living ammunition or wield massive bone swords that can cleave through ceramite armor, and they possess an intelligence that allows them to direct tactical operations with effectiveness that rivals trained Imperial commanders. The swarm adapts constantly, each generation incorporating genetic material harvested from consumed prey, developing new resistances and capabilities tailored to overcome whatever defenses they encountered in previous engagements. The Tyranid invasion process follows a pattern that has repeated across hundreds of worlds. The Hive fleet approaches a target system and releases spores into the upper atmosphere of inhabited worlds. These spores drift down over days or weeks, settling into the ecosystem and beginning the process of preparing the planet for consumption. The spores contain microorganisms that alter the chemical composition of water sources, making them toxic to native life while nurturing Tyranid organisms. Vegetation begins to die or mutate into forms that serve the Hive fleet's purposes. The air itself becomes harder to breathe as the spores multiply and release chemical compounds that terraform the atmosphere toward conditions optimal for Tyranid biology. The main assault begins after this preparation phase, with mycetic spores falling from orbit like meteors. These living drop pods contain the swarm's assault organisms, which emerge immediately upon impact and begin killing everything they encounter. The Tyranids display no interest in capturing strategic locations or preserving infrastructure. They simply advance in overwhelming numbers, killing and consuming as they go. Defenders who manage to destroy attacking organisms discover that even victory in individual engagements serves the Hive fleet's purposes. Ripper swarms, small creatures barely larger than rats but possessing voracious appetites and surprising aggression, follow behind the main assault waves. These creatures consume everything organic they encounter, including the bodies of fallen Tyranids, breaking down the biomass and storing it in their bodies before returning to collection points where larger organisms harvest them. The final stage of a Tyranid invasion involves the deployment of capillary towers, massive organic structures that extend from the planet's surface into the upper atmosphere. These towers function as biological pumps, drawing up the digested biomass that covers the planet's surface and transferring it to the Hive ships in orbit. The process reduces entire worlds to barren rocks stripped of atmosphere, water, and every molecule of organic matter. The Tyranids leave behind dead planets that will never support life again, their surfaces scoured clean down to the bedrock, their atmospheres vented into space. The biomass collected feeds the Hive fleet's growth, allowing it to spawn more organisms and continue its advance toward the next target world. The Imperium's response to Tyranid invasions demonstrates the limitations of conventional military doctrine when facing an enemy that operates on such alien principles. Standard Imperial tactics rely on destroying enemy command structures, disrupting supply lines, and breaking the enemy's will to fight. The Tyranids have no command structure that can be targeted separately from the swarm itself, no supply lines to disrupt because they consume everything they need from the environment, and no will that can be broken because individual organisms possess no survival instinct beyond serving the Hive mind. Killing Tyranid organisms in the millions barely slows the advance because the hive fleet simply produces more from the biomass it collects. Every human soldier who dies fighting the Tyranids becomes raw material for spawning additional enemy organisms, creating a horrific arithmetic where Imperial casualties actively strengthen the enemy. The Cryptman line represents the Imperium's most desperate and controversial response to the Tyranid threat. Inquisitor Cryptman, after studying multiple hive fleet invasions and recognizing that conventional military responses could not stop the Tyranids, proposed a strategy of creating a cordon sanitaire, a dead zone of lifeless worlds that would starve approaching hive fleets. His plan involved exterminatus on a scale never before contemplated, the deliberate destruction of dozens of Imperial worlds along the Tyranids' projected path of advance. The worlds were given minimal warning, just enough time to evacuate a fraction of their populations before Imperial Navy vessels arrived and reduced their biospheres to ash and radioactive waste. Billions died in the implementation of the Cryptman line, but the strategy achieved its goal of creating a barrier of dead worlds that offered no biomass for the Tyranids to harvest. The moral implications of the Cryptman line sparked fierce debate within the Inquisition and the highest levels of Imperial authority. Cryptman himself was declared excommunicate traitoris, not for the strategy itself, but for implementing it without proper authorization, and for the scale of destruction he unleashed on Imperial citizens. Yet the Cryptman line demonstrably worked, forcing Hive Fleet Leviathan to divert around the dead zone and buying the Imperium time to reinforce threatened sectors. The incident illustrates the impossible choices the Imperium faces when confronting existential threats. Cryptman killed billions to potentially save trillions, and whether this calculus justifies his actions remains a question that Imperial authorities have not definitively answered. The Orcs represent a completely different category of Xenos threat, one that humanity has faced since before the Imperium's founding and will likely continue facing until one species or the other achieves complete extinction. The Greenskins are not a conventional biological species, but rather a fungal organism that reproduces through spores released when an orc dies. This reproductive method makes orc infestations nearly impossible to eradicate completely. A single orc killed on a human world releases spores that will eventually germinate into more orcs, and even the smallest population of greenskins can regenerate into a full-scale invasion given sufficient time. Worlds that have been cleansed of orc presence multiple times find themselves facing new infestations decades or centuries later, the spores lying dormant in the soil until conditions allow them to germinate. Orcs exist for war. Their entire biology and psychology revolves around combat, with larger and more successful orcs growing physically bigger and stronger through a process that seems to defy biological logic. A young orc might stand slightly taller than a human, but a veteran warboss who has survived decades of constant warfare can reach 3 meters in height and possess strength sufficient to tear a man in half with bare hands. The Greenskins organize themselves into a hierarchy based entirely on size and combat prowess, with the biggest orc in any group automatically assuming leadership through the simple expedient of beating any challengers into submission. This system creates a rough meritocracy where leadership correlates directly with combat effectiveness, and orc society functions with surprising efficiency despite appearing completely anarchic to outside observers. The orc WAAGH represents the species' most dangerous expression of collective action. When a particularly large and successful warboss begins accumulating victories, other orcs are drawn to them through a psychic field that the Greenskins generate unconsciously. The orcs possess latent psychic abilities that manifest as a gestalt field, their collective belief in certain things making those things more likely to function as the orcs expect. This field strengthens as more orcs gather together, creating a feedback loop where success attracts more followers, and more followers increase the chances of further success. A WAAGH in full swing can encompass millions of orcs spread across multiple star systems, their ramshackle fleets converging on target worlds with single-minded enthusiasm for the violence to come. Orc technology operates on principles that tech priests find deeply offensive to their understanding of how machines should function. Orc weapons are crude assemblages of scrap metal, components stolen from human or other Xenos equipment, and parts that appear to serve no mechanical purpose whatsoever. A typical orc shooter consists of a metal tube with a firing mechanism that might be a trigger, might be a button, or might simply be a lever that the orc pulls when they want the weapon to fire. These weapons fire massive caliber rounds with terrible accuracy, but devastating effect when they hit. The ammunition itself is often mismatched, with orcs loading whatever projectiles they can find into their weapons without concern for whether the caliber matches or the rounds were designed for the weapon in question. Yet these weapons function, and they function reliably enough that orcs can wage war across the galaxy using them. The explanation for this apparent impossibility lies in the orc psychic field. The Greenskins believe their weapons will work, and this collective belief makes the weapons more likely to function as intended. An orc shooter examined by a tech priest might be found to have no firing pin, insufficient barrel strength to contain the explosive force of its ammunition, and a trigger mechanism that is not actually connected to anything. Yet when an orc pulls the trigger, the weapon fires, because the orc expects it to fire, and the psychic field makes that expectation into reality. This same principle applies to orc vehicles, which are massive constructions of welded scrap metal, painted in bright colors and covered in spikes and glyphs. These vehicles should not be able to move, let alone function as effective weapons platforms, but they do because the orcs believe they will. The orc obsession with speed manifests most clearly in the speed freak clans, who paint their vehicles red because they believe red ones go faster. This belief, reinforced by the psychic field, actually makes red orc vehicles faster than identical vehicles painted other colors. The Imperium has documented cases of orc vehicles outpacing Imperial equivalents despite having inferior engines and less aerodynamic designs, purely because the orcs piloting them were absolutely convinced of their speed. This reality warping effect creates enormous difficulties for Imperial forces attempting to combat orc invasions using conventional military logic. Tactics that should work against the Greenskins fail because orc equipment performs beyond its theoretical capabilities, and strategies based on rational analysis of orc capabilities prove insufficient when the orcs' belief in their own effectiveness makes them more dangerous than they have any right to be. The endless wars that define the 41st millennium serve the orcs perfectly, providing them with constant opportunities for combat and allowing their populations to grow and spread. Every Imperial world that faces attack from any source becomes a potential target for opportunistic orc invasions. The Greenskins monitor human conflicts through methods that remain poorly understood, appearing seemingly at random to join battles that promise good fighting. Orc freebooters, pirates, and raiders who operate independently of larger WAAGH movements, prowl shipping lanes, and attack isolated worlds, their raids generating the spores that will eventually create new orc populations on the worlds they strike. The Imperium's strategy of fighting constant wars of expansion and defense inadvertently creates ideal conditions for orc proliferation, ensuring that humanity will never be free of the Greenskin threat. The Eldari present a completely different challenge, one rooted in their ancient civilization's superiority in technology and their fundamentally alien psychology. The Craftworld Eldari are the remnants of a species that once ruled the galaxy, their empire spanning millions of worlds during humanity's prehistoric era. The fall of the Eldari, the catastrophic psychic event that birthed the chaos god Slaanesh and destroyed their civilization, left only scattered survivors fleeing aboard massive spacecraft called Craftworlds. These survivors view humanity as primitives, barely evolved beyond barbarism, and their interactions with the Imperium reflect this contempt. Eldari forces strike Imperial worlds without warning, their objectives incomprehensible to human commanders who cannot understand why the Xenos attack certain targets, while ignoring others that appear more strategically valuable. The Eldari possess technology that makes Imperial equipment appear crude by comparison. Their weapons fire streams of monomolecular disks or focused energy that cuts through armor with ease. Their vehicles, grav tanks and jet bikes that move with impossible grace, outmaneuver Imperial armor through a combination of superior technology and pilots whose reflexes and skill far exceed human capabilities. Eldari Aspect Warriors, specialists who dedicate themselves to mastering specific forms of combat, fight with a precision and efficiency that Space Marines respect even as they kill them. A squad of dire Avengers armed with shuriken catapults can shred an Imperial Guard platoon in seconds, their weapons firing thousands of monomolecular discs that reduce targets to chunks of meat before the humans can effectively return fire. The Drukhari, the dark kin who inhabit the webway city of Camorra, make the craftworld Eldari's occasional raids seem benign by comparison. These sadists require the suffering of other sentient beings to sustain their own existence, their souls slowly being consumed by Slaanesh unless they regularly inflict torture and pain on victims. Drukhari raids on Imperial worlds follow no strategic logic that Imperial commanders can discern. The Dark Eldari strike from the webway, a network of extra-dimensional tunnels that allows them to appear anywhere without warning, seize captives, and disappear before effective resistance can be organized. They prefer to take their victims alive, using weapons that cause excruciating pain without killing and employing tactics designed to spread terror and panic rather than achieve military objectives. The captives taken in Drukhari raids face fates worse than death. They are transported to Camorra and subjected to tortures that can last for years or decades, their suffering harvested by their captors to sustain the Drukhari's existence. The Dark Eldari have perfected the art of inflicting pain, their homunculi possessing knowledge of biology and anatomy that allows them to keep victims alive and conscious through procedures that should kill within minutes. Some captives are transformed into grotesques, their bodies surgically modified into living weapons or decorative pieces for their captors' amusement. Others are simply tortured until their minds break, then discarded or sold to other Drukhari for further use. The Imperium can do nothing to recover these victims. Camorra exists outside real space, accessible only through the webway, and no Imperial force has ever successfully penetrated that dark city to rescue captives or punish the raiders. The Tau Empire represents a relatively recent addition to the threats facing humanity, a young species that has achieved interstellar civilization within the span of a few thousand years. The Tau preach the philosophy of the greater good, a collectivist ideology that claims all species can work together for mutual benefit if they abandon their primitive attachments to individual identity and tribal loyalty. To Imperial authorities, this philosophy represents insidious corruption as dangerous as chaos worship. The Tau offer conquered populations integration into their empire, promising technological advancement, improved living conditions, and a voice in governance. Some Imperial worlds, particularly those on the eastern fringe far from Terra's direct oversight, have accepted these offers, their populations willingly abandoning the Emperor's light for the material benefits the Tau provide. The Tau prosecute warfare through superior technology and tactical doctrine that emphasizes ranged combat and combined arms operations. Tau fire warriors carry pulse rifles that outrange and outperform Imperial lasguns, their weapons firing plasma pulses that can punch through ceramite armor at distances where human soldiers cannot effectively return fire. Tau battle suits, piloted combat walkers equipped with devastating weapon systems, provide fire support that can destroy Imperial armor before it closes to effective range. The Tau avoid close combat whenever possible, their doctrine built around maintaining distance and destroying enemies with overwhelming firepower. This approach works effectively against most Imperial forces, whose tactics often rely on closing to melee range, where superior numbers and fanaticism can overcome technological disadvantages. The Tau's willingness to accept alien auxiliaries into their military forces provides them with capabilities that compensate for their own weaknesses. Kroot mercenaries, carnivorous aliens who absorb genetic traits from creatures they consume, serve as close combat specialists and scouts. Vespid warriors, insectoid aliens equipped with neutron blasters, provide fast-moving fire support. The Tau integrate these auxiliaries into their command structure, using them to fill roles that Tau forces handle poorly while maintaining overall strategic control. This pragmatic approach to warfare and governance makes the Tau dangerous not through raw military power, which remains inferior to the Imperiums in terms of scale, but through their ability to subvert imperial worlds through propaganda and genuine improvements in living conditions for conquered populations. The Necrons represent an ancient threat only recently awakened, their tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy beginning to stir after 60 million years of hibernation. These mechanical beings were once a living species called the Necrontyr, who made pacts with star gods called the Khatan and were transformed into undying machines. The Necrons possess technology that makes even the Eldari's achievements seem primitive, weapons that strip matter at the molecular level, and devices that manipulate time and space in ways that defy human comprehension. A Necron warrior destroyed in battle can self-repair or be reconstructed by the tomb world systems, making them effectively immortal unless completely disintegrated. Necron forces advance with implacable patience, their Gauss weapons reducing Imperial soldiers and vehicles to component atoms, while the Necrons themselves shrug off damage that would destroy any organic opponent. The awakening of Necron tomb worlds proceeds slowly and unevenly across the galaxy, with some tombs activating and beginning campaigns of reconquest, while others remain dormant or have been damaged by the passage of millions of years. The Necrons view the current inhabitants of the galaxy as vermin infesting what they consider their rightful territory. They make no attempts at communication or negotiation with younger species, simply beginning systematic extermination campaigns to clear their territory of organic life. Imperial forces that encounter awakening Necron tomb worlds face enemies that cannot be reasoned with, bribed, or intimidated, who possess overwhelming technological superiority, and who will continue fighting until either they are completely destroyed or they achieve their objectives of purging all life from their territory. Beyond these major threats, the galaxy hosts countless minor Xenos species, each presenting unique dangers to Imperial worlds. The Atrud temporal parasites whose presence accelerates time around them, causing humans to age decades in hours of exposure. The Rangdan, a species that nearly destroyed the Imperium during the Great Crusade, and whose very existence has been largely purged from Imperial records. The Enslavers, psychic parasites that emerge through warp rifts and take control of entire populations. The Quoral insectoid aliens whose swarmhood operates with hive mind coordination and whose territory in the galactic core remains unconquered despite multiple Imperial crusades. Each of these species, and hundreds of others, controls territory that the Imperium cannot reclaim and poses threats that require constant vigilance to contain. The fundamental reality facing humanity in the 41st millennium is that the Imperium has no allies. Every other intelligent species in the galaxy pursues goals that conflict with human survival and Imperial expansion. The Tyranids seek to consume all biomass. The Orcs exist for war and will fight humanity until one species achieves complete extinction of the other. The Eldari view humans as primitives whose lives matter only insofar as they can be manipulated to serve Eldari purposes. The Tau offer false hope of cooperation while working to subvert Imperial authority and incorporate human worlds into their empire. The Necrons consider all organic life to be temporary infestations in territory that rightfully belongs to them. Chaos seeks humanity's corruption and damnation. In this galaxy of endless war, humanity stands alone, surrounded by enemies on all sides, fighting for survival against threats that vastly outnumber the Imperium's defenders and possess capabilities that Imperial forces cannot match through conventional military means. The warp exists as humanity's reflection, a dimension where thought and emotion become tangible forces that shape reality itself. Every human feeling, from the rage of a soldier in combat to the despair of a hive worker watching their children starve, creates ripples in that immaterial realm. These ripples accumulate over millennia, coalescing into patterns and structures that eventually achieve something approximating consciousness. The Chaos Gods are not external invaders or alien entities that humanity must fight. They are humanity's own nature-given form and power, the crystallized essence of human emotion, twisted into entities of such vast psychic presence that they can reach across the barrier between dimensions and corrupt the material universe directly. Khorne, the blood god, embodies humanity's capacity for violence and the primal satisfaction that comes from inflicting death. Every murder, every act of rage, every moment when a human being chooses violence over restraint feeds Khorne's power. The god cares nothing for the cause or justification behind the bloodshed. A soldier killing in defense of their home contributes as much to Khorne's strength as a murderer killing for pleasure. The blood god's realm in the warp consists of endless battlefields where demons and the souls of the damned fight eternally, their blood flowing in rivers that feed an ocean of gore surrounding Khorne's brass throne. The skulls of the slain pile into mountains that reach toward a sky filled with the screams of the dying. Khorne offers his followers straightforward bargains: strength in combat, the ability to kill more effectively, and the simple pleasure of watching enemies die. The corruption begins subtly, with a soldier noticing they feel more alive during combat than at any other time, that the act of killing provides satisfaction that nothing else can match. The progression leads inevitably to a state where the corrupted individual needs violence the way others need food or water, their entire existence reduced to the pursuit of the next kill. Nurgle, the Plague Father, draws power from humanity's suffering, despair, and the inevitable decay that claims all living things. The god offers relief from pain through acceptance of corruption, promising that those who embrace disease and decay will no longer fear death or suffer from their afflictions. Nurgle's garden in the warp grows with impossible fecundity, every plant and creature rotting even as it lives, the air thick with the smell of decomposition, and the buzzing of flies that carry plagues capable of destroying entire worlds. The plague god views his creations with genuine affection, calling his followers his children and bestowing gifts of disease that transform them into bloated, rotting mockeries of human form. The corruption appeals particularly to those suffering chronic illness or living in conditions where disease is endemic. A hive worker dying slowly from industrial toxins might pray to the emperor for relief and receive only silence, then hear Nurgle's whisper promising an end to pain. The worker accepts, and the pain does fade, replaced by a numb contentment even as their body swells with infection and their flesh begins to rot. Nurgle's followers spread plague wherever they go, their very presence contaminating environments and infecting populations with diseases that defy medical treatment and mutate faster than remedies can be developed. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, feeds on humanity's desire for change, the hope that tomorrow might be better than today, and the schemes and plots that individuals weave as they attempt to improve their circumstances. The Changer of Ways offers knowledge and power to those who seek it, revealing secrets that allow his followers to manipulate events and people to achieve their goals. Tzeentch's realm shifts constantly, its crystalline structures rearranging themselves according to patterns that reflect the god's incomprehensible plans. The architect of fate plays games with reality itself, moving mortals like pieces on a board that spans galaxies and millennia, his schemes so complex that even his own demons cannot fully understand them. The corruption begins with a simple desire for understanding or the belief that possessing certain knowledge would allow someone to make things better. A planetary governor facing rebellion might seek forbidden texts that promise solutions to social unrest, or a tech priest might pursue ancient knowledge that the Mechanicus has declared heretical. The knowledge they gain proves useful, solving immediate problems and providing genuine benefits, which encourages further seeking. Each step down this path leads deeper into Tzeentch's web, until the corrupted individual realizes too late that they have become a pawn in schemes they cannot comprehend, their actions serving purposes they never intended. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, was born from the Eldari civilization's descent into hedonistic excess, but the god draws power from all sentient species' pursuit of sensation and experience. Slaanesh embodies the desire for more, the belief that satisfaction lies in the next experience, the next sensation, the next achievement. The god's realm in the warp consists of palaces of impossible beauty where every desire can be fulfilled, but fulfillment never brings satisfaction, only hunger for greater and more extreme experiences. Slaanesh offers followers the promise of perfect pleasure, of experiences so intense that nothing in normal existence can compare. The corruption begins innocuously, with someone pursuing excellence in art, combat, or any other field, seeking to perfect their craft beyond normal human limitations. A musician might practice until their fingers bleed, driven by the need to create the perfect performance. A warrior might push themselves beyond reasonable limits, seeking the perfect kill. The pursuit of excellence gradually transforms into addiction to the sensations associated with that pursuit, and then into need for increasingly extreme experiences as previous achievements lose their ability to satisfy. Slaanesch's followers eventually require acts of such depravity and excess that they become monsters, their humanity consumed by insatiable hunger for sensation that can never truly be satisfied. The presence of chaos corruption within imperial society creates a threat that conventional military force cannot address effectively. A chaos cult might begin with a single individual who discovers a forbidden text in an underhive library, or who experiences a moment of genuine psychic contact with one of the ruinous powers during a moment of extreme emotional stress. That individual begins recruiting others, carefully selecting prospects who show signs of dissatisfaction with their circumstances or who possess desires that imperial society cannot fulfill. The cult grows slowly, its members meeting in secret locations and performing rituals that gradually open them to chaos influence. A worker suffering from chronic pain might be introduced to Nurgle worship through promises of relief. A frustrated administratum clerk who sees corruption and inefficiency destroying the world they serve might be drawn to Tzeentch through texts that promise knowledge of how to fix the system. An enforcer who has killed so many criminals that normal life feels empty might fall to Khorne through the realization that combat is the only time they feel truly alive. The cults operate in the spaces between imperial authority, hiding among populations too large for effective monitoring. A hive city with billions of inhabitants cannot be policed comprehensively. The Arbites focus on threats to imperial authority, not on small groups meeting in abandoned sections of the Underhive. The ecclesiarchy preaches the imperial creed, but individual priests cannot monitor every citizen's private beliefs. The cults exploit this reality, growing until they achieve sufficient size and power to reveal themselves through acts of violence or sabotage that serve their patron god's purposes. A Khorne cult might launch a coordinated uprising, attacking military installations and government facilities with suicidal fury. A Nurgle cult might contaminate water supplies with engineered plagues. A Tzeentch cult might orchestrate political manipulation that brings down planetary governments or turns imperial forces against each other. A Slaanesh cult might conduct mass rituals that draw demonic attention and create warp rifts through which demons can manifest. The imperial response to discovered cults involves overwhelming force and complete eradication of everyone associated with the corruption. The Arbites cordon off infected areas, preventing anyone from escaping, then deploy with flamers and explosives to purge the cultists and anyone who might have been exposed to their influence. The Inquisition coordinates larger responses, calling in Imperial Guard regiments or Space Marine forces when the cult's size or the severity of corruption requires more than local authorities can handle. The purges kill innocents alongside the guilty because determining who has been corrupted and who has merely been exposed to corruption proves impossible in practice. A family living in the same hab block as cultists might have no knowledge of their neighbors' activities, but they die in the purge because exposure to chaos creates taint that can spread through proximity and contact. The Imperium accepts these civilian casualties as necessary, because allowing even one corrupted individual to escape risks the corruption spreading to new locations. The nobility and upper classes of imperial society prove as vulnerable to chaos corruption as the masses, perhaps more so because their positions provide resources and influence that make them valuable targets for the ruinous powers. A planetary governor facing rebellion might be approached by a Tzeentchian cult promising knowledge of how to identify and eliminate the rebellion's leaders. A noble house declining in wealth and influence might turn to Slaanesh in pursuit of the perfect experience that will restore their prestige. A military commander losing a critical campaign might pray to Khorne for the strength to achieve victory regardless of cost. The corruption of high-ranking imperial officials creates catastrophic situations because their authority allows them to spread corruption throughout the institutions they control. A corrupted planetary governor can redirect resources to support cult activities, suppress investigations into chaos worship, and use their position to recruit other officials into the cult. The fall of entire worlds to chaos often begins with the corruption of a single influential individual whose position allows them to undermine imperial authority from within. The traitor legions represent chaos corruption on the largest and most devastating scale. During the Horus Heresy, 10,000 years ago, half of the Emperor's Space Marine legions turned against him under the leadership of Warmaster Horus. These legions, the finest warriors humanity had ever produced, became corrupted through various means. The word-bearers fell to chaos worship after their Primarch Lorgar sought gods worthy of worship and found the ruinous powers. The World Eaters descended into corn worship through their Primarch Angron's rage, and the psycho-surgical implants called the Butcher's Nails that turned them into berserkers. The Thousand Sons sought forbidden knowledge and fell to Tzeentch despite believing they could control the powers they wielded. The Emperor's children pursued perfection until Slaanesh claimed them. The Death Guard accepted Nurgle's gifts during a desperate moment when their fleet was trapped in the warp and plague ravaged their ships. The traitor legions fled to the Eye of Terror after their defeat during the Siege of Terra, entering that region of space where the warp bleeds into real space and the normal laws of physics break down. Within the Eye, time flows inconsistently, and the traitor Marines have experienced subjective centuries or millennia of warfare, while only 10,000 years passed in real space. They have become something beyond the Space Marines they once were, their bodies mutated by prolonged exposure to chaos energy, and their minds twisted by 10 millennia of service to the Dark Gods. A Chaos Space Marine might have tusks growing from their jaw, their armor fused directly to mutated flesh, additional limbs sprouting from their torso, or eyes that see into the warp. They carry weapons that scream with demonic voices, armor that writhes with corrupt life, and banners that cause madness in those who look upon them. The Long War, as the traitor legions call their 10,000-year conflict with the Imperium, continues without pause. Chaos Space Marine warbands launch raids from the Eye of Terror and other warp rifts, striking Imperial worlds to gather slaves, resources, and recruits for their endless war. They attack with the tactical expertise of Space Marines combined with the unholy powers granted by their patron gods. A World Eater's warband charges into battle as frenzied berserkers, their rage making them nearly immune to pain and driving them to fight until every enemy is dead or they themselves fall. A Thousand Sons warband employs sorcery that tears holes in reality and summons demons to fight alongside them. An Emperor's Children warband uses sonic weapons that liquefy targets and conducts their warfare as a performance designed to generate the intense sensations they crave. A Death Guard warband spreads plague wherever they go, their very presence contaminating environments and infecting defenders with diseases that kill within hours. The traitor legions recruit new members from corrupted Imperial worlds and from loyalist Space Marines who fall to chaos. A Chaos warband that captures loyalist Marines subjects them to torture, corruption, and exposure to warp energies designed to break their conditioning and turn them to chaos worship. Some resist unto death, their gene seed harvested for the warband's use in creating new Chaos Marines. Others break and accept corruption, their transformation into Chaos Space Marines involving both physical mutation and spiritual damnation. The process creates warriors who retain their training and combat effectiveness while gaining powers that loyalist Marines cannot match. A newly corrupted Chaos Marine might develop the ability to channel warp energy through their weapons, or gain mutations that enhance their strength beyond even Space Marine norms, or receive visions from their patron god that allow them to predict enemy movements. The ultimate futility of the Imperium's struggle against chaos becomes apparent when examining how Imperial policies and practices feed the very entities they fight against. The Imperium maintains order through fear, violence, and oppression that creates the despair and suffering that empowers Nurgle. The constant warfare that the Imperium prosecutes across the galaxy generates oceans of blood and mountains of skulls that strengthen Khorne. The Byzantine political schemes and the pursuit of knowledge that drives both the Mechanicus and various imperial officials feeds Tzeentch. The pursuit of excellence and the sensory extremes that some imperial citizens seek in attempts to escape their miserable existence serve Slaanesh. Every aspect of imperial society contributes to chaos in some way, creating a cycle where the methods used to maintain the Imperium simultaneously empower the forces that seek to destroy it. The Imperium cannot reform these practices without risking collapse. Reducing the oppression and violence that maintains order would lead to rebellions and chaos that chaos cults would exploit. Ending the constant warfare would allow Xeno's threats to overwhelm humanity. Restricting the pursuit of knowledge would doom the Imperium to technological regression that would make it unable to maintain its current military capabilities. The Imperium is trapped in a system where survival requires the very darkness that dooms the species to eventual corruption and destruction. The Emperor, entombed on the Golden Throne, maintains the astronomicon that allows the Imperium to function, but his continued existence requires the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, an act of such monumental cruelty that it feeds the dark gods even as it enables humanity's survival. The citizens of the Imperium live under this shadow without understanding the full scope of the trap they inhabit. They are told that faith in the Emperor will protect them, that following imperial law will keep them safe, and that the suffering they endure serves humanity's survival. The truth, known only to the highest levels of imperial authority and the Inquisition, is that humanity is slowly losing the long war. Chaos corruption spreads faster than it can be purged. The Eye of Terror expands, and new warp rifts open across the galaxy. The great rift that tore across the Imperium following the fall of Cadia has cut the Imperium in half, creating vast regions where the warp bleeds into real space and demons manifest without requiring rituals or summoning. The Imperium responds to each crisis with the same brutal methods that have sustained it for 10 millennia, knowing these methods feed chaos, but having no alternative that would not result in immediate collapse. In the grim darkness of the far future, humanity faces extinction from within as much as from external threats. The Chaos Gods grow stronger with each passing century, fed by humanity's own nature, and the suffering that the Imperium inflicts on its citizens in the name of survival. The traitor legions wage their long war with patience born from 10,000 years of conflict, knowing that time favors chaos as the Imperium slowly exhausts itself fighting endless wars on every front. The cults spread through imperial society like cancer, hidden until they grow large enough to strike, and then erupting in violence that requires devastating responses that kill millions and leave worlds scarred. The demons press against the barriers between dimensions, seeking any weakness that will allow them to manifest and spread corruption further. There is no victory possible in this struggle, no final defeat of chaos that would end the threat permanently. Humanity can only continue fighting, continue sacrificing, and continue hoping that tomorrow will not be the day when the darkness finally overwhelms the Emperor's light, and the species falls to the corruption it has been fighting since before the Imperium's founding. In this nightmare without end, the greatest enemy is not the alien or the heretic, but humanity's own nature, reflected back through the warp as gods of such terrible power that they can never be truly defeated, only resisted at costs that grow higher with each passing year, until the final reckoning comes, and the Imperium discovers whether 10,000 years of suffering and sacrifice have been enough to ensure humanity's survival, or merely delayed its inevitable damnation.